with the consideration of the motion for the approval of the estimates of revenues and expenditures for the year 2021, 2022, together with the budget statement in support thereof. The minister presented the budget last week, and we'll start today with the reply from the shadow minister, the opposition leader, Honorable Member Carol Simons, and then once she's completed, we'll start the open economic debate on the budget. Members, let me just do a little bit of housekeeping. Because as was last week with the Minister of Finance, when he presented the budget, it was carried live on CITV and on the Facebook. Similarly, it will be done again this time for the Shadow Minister, which means we need all members to ensure that the mics are off and that there's a clear open mic just for the Shadow Minister when he does his presentation, because any little sound will be picked up on the CITV and Facebook, and we need to make sure that we can control all unnecessary background noises. I believe the Minister will open us up to take us into the debate, and then the Shadow Minister makes his presentation.
Good afternoon, Mr. Speaker.
Yes, Minister of Finance, will you just open us up to lead us into the debate, please?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the estimates of revenue and expenditure for the year 2021-22 be approved.
Thank you, Minister of Finance. Shadow Minister, Opposition Leader, are you ready to present your reply to the budget debate? Can we get you one sec? Maybe we can see if we can get you unmuted here. Okay, you are about to be unmuted. Okay, you unmuted? Yes. Okay, you have the floor, sir, and all other mics will be muted during your presentation.
Mr. Speaker, without a doubt, 2020 will forever be remembered as the year that the COVID-19 pandemic struck the world, and without warning, COVID into a freefold. It also helped to reset the dial for the new global order. We began the year with the presumption of living our lives in a normal manner, and suddenly the world was abruptly plunged into a global pandemic. We were mandated to shelter in place, work remotely in teams, Zoom into meetings, study and worship online, purchase groceries online or on designated shopping days, and spend more time with our families. Throughout, riots and demonstrations of civil unrest around the globe, our new reality now includes social distancing, washing our hands with increasing regularity, and compulsory wearing of masks in public places. Mr. Speaker, on the economic front, the societal disruption in Bermuda has been grave. Let's face it, we were just not prepared for this type of catastrophic event. It was a shock to our economy. It was a stress test that revealed that Bermuda's fiscal management and the Progressive Labor Party government is seriously lacking. While Bermuda has a great history of managing our way through disasters like hurricanes, the pandemic proved to be more than overwhelming. We don't have to go too far to find out that many of our sisters, brothers, mothers, fathers, aunts, uncles have lost or are losing their jobs, and we cannot stand idly by. We must do whatever we can to support these families, both economically and socially. On this 21 square mile island, we are literally our brother's keeper. Mr. Speaker, 100-year-old business institutions have closed. Restaurants and popular retail stores have shut their doors, and major sporting events were cancelled. Our tourism and travel industries are decimated, resulting in the closure of some hotels, guest houses, and the very dramatic rise in unemployment across all sectors. This bleak economic picture will continue until we have COVID-19 under control. The One Bermuda Alliance believes that a healthy population is needed to support the development of a healthy economy. In addition, a robust national recovery plan must be crafted to guide Bermuda into an economic renaissance. Mr. Speaker, we also believe that this economic shock will provide opportunities for bold new initiatives, requiring us to revisit tried and proven programs, which deserve our immediate attention without political bias. We must examine new ways to work together towards a common end, as collectively we chart our way through the path of economic recovery and rehabilitation. Bermuda is small and agile enough to do it. Mr. Speaker, Bermuda needs an economic recovery plan, which is more than aspirational. The current budget presents details on the principles and aspiration of a plan, but unfortunately, it has not presented measurable milestones to define Bermuda's roadmap to economic recovery. Mr. Speaker, we must rebuild a vibrant economy. An economy where jobs are created with a focus on equity, diversity, fair trade, and real opportunities for Bermudians. We must find investors to support small businesses and our local economy, and we all must buy Bermuda. This rebuilding process should be supported by a realistic blueprint or an economic recovery plan. A recovery plan that is workable and addresses Bermuda's fiscal framework and infrastructure investment strategies. We must develop a bold prospectus for the country which will be attractive to potential investors. One that will build trust and a real bond with our business community through the deployment of taxes and business support, through the prioritization and delivery of green investments, through strategic investments in tourism and hospitality, the arts and creative sectors, seniors care, philanthropic sector, and let's not forget the critical support of our students. As a result of COVID-19, changes have taken place in the workplace. We must identify new skills training for the labor market, apprenticeships, and job guarantee programs, all of which will promote an economic framework that will value and support all of Bermuda's assets. Mr. Speaker, in 2021 and beyond, there is a view that there will be a better sense of normalcy by the end of the year. It's thought that this will be realized through the fields of medicine and health sciences. As we are nearing the one-year anniversary since the pandemic began, we can now see that globally there have been improvements in the management of the risk associated with the virus and its effects. As global citizens, we learn to better manage and live with COVID-19, much like the flu and the AIDS virus, which unfortunately have not been eliminated. There is now a sense of optimism that people should be able to go about their daily lives with the post-COVID-19 constraints, and that our economy should be poised to experience a reboot to more self-sustaining levels. This view was recently endorsed by the Honourable Matt Hancock, the UK Minister of Health. According to the BBC, Mr. Hancock commented that the adoption of vaccines and treatments by the end of the year, it could mean that COVID-19 will be an illness that we live with, like we do with the flu. He went on to say that he hoped that new drugs will be introduced by the end of 2021, which could make COVID-19 a treatable disease, and that the drugs and vaccines represent our way out to freedom. And further, the new treatments and new antibody treatments are needed for a small number who may not be protected by vaccines. Mr. Speaker, living with COVID-19 safely will also depend on vaccines to reduce the number of admitted to hospitals, reduce the number of deaths, reduce the transmission of the virus. Mr. Speaker, according to the IMF, in a report dated October 2020, a long and difficult essay, the global economy is climbing out of the depths to which it had plummeted during the lockdown in April. However, the pandemic continued to spread. Many countries slowed their reopening, and some are reinstating partial lockdowns to protect their vulnerable population. Global growth outlook and risks. According to the IMF, global growth was projected to be 4.4% in 2020, which is a less severe contraction than was forecasted in June 2020. This revision reflects a better than expected second quarter GDP result, mostly in advanced economies, which actually began to improve sooner than expected, after lockdowns were scaled back in May and June, as well as indicators of a strong recovery in the third quarter. Global growth is projected at 5.25% in 2021, a little more than the June 2020, which rejected a more moderate projected downturn for 2020 and is consistent with the expectations of persistent social distancing. Following the contraction in 2020 and recovery in 21, the level of global GDP in 2021 is expected to be a modest 0.6% above that of 2019. The growth projections imply that there are wide negative output gaps, elevated unemployment rates this year, and well into 2020, across both advanced and emerging market economies. Impact on the U.S. economy. Mr. Speaker, a leading economist at Pantheon Macroeconomics stated that like many advanced 20 countries, there has been measurable advances in the management, containment, and acceptance of COVID-19 as a way of life, as evidenced by the U.S. economy, which is now showing the green shoots of recovery. There is also real evidence to indicate that the cases of COVID-19 are declining and hospitalizations are slowing down at a steady rate. These reductions are reportedly due to either prior infections, increased vaccinations, and increased efforts to achieve herd immunity. As a result, there is a real sense amongst many economists that when it comes to COVID-19, the U.S. is in the beginning stages of a sustained and permanent retreat, and that its economy is beginning to slowly reopen. It is further thought that the U.S. Congress may pass a relief bill worth approximately $1.7 trillion by the end of March 2021. This economic safety net will result in an extension of the company's enhanced unemployment benefits and provide a moratorium for evictions and foreclosures until September 2021. The U.S. media has also indicated that there will be payments of $1,400 to most households. Mr. Speaker, with this type of economic support and fiscal stimulus, economists agree that normal life in the U.S. will resume for the most part by the middle of this year. It is expected that as COVID infections subside and restrictions are lifted, the consumer confidence will increase, along with the corresponding increase in consumer spending, especially in the various service sectors. They went on to indicate that by March 2021, U.S. households will have accumulated savings balances of some $2 trillion, which is almost 10% of the GDP since February 2020. This is due largely to the savings generated by the enforced cutbacks on spending on discretionary services and stimulus payments to households. Pent-up demand for leisure, recreation, entertainment, and travel-related services are also forecast to reach unprecedented levels. Economists further believe that the US dollar is at one of its lowest levels from a trading perspective, and that a US economic rebound is inevitable, and capital would head back to the US as COVID-19 fades. We believe that this positive outlook will provide invaluable benefits to Bermuda, as the US is our largest trading partner. The EU challenges. Mr. Speaker, in the 2013 report by the European Parliament Directorate General for Internal Policies, entitled European Initiatives on Eliminating Tax Havens and Offshore Financial Transactions and the Impact of These Constructions on the Union's Own Resources and Budget, they reviewed the impact of tax havens, secrecy jurisdictions, and similar structures on the EU. The report concludes that the availability of these structures constrains the EU budget and undermines the fiscal recovery of the EU. Member states, they distort markets by conferring advantages on large companies that engage in transfer pricing. The report notes that the shadow economy in the US is estimated to be approximately $2 trillion, and that tax evasion is estimated to be 1 trillion euros annually. It is further noted that recent reports suggest that the tens of billions of euros are held offshore and unreported and untaxed. The Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe recently commented that Council of Europe member states lose billions every year due to tax avoidance, tax evasion, and tax fraud, which are facilitated by the offshore financial systems, including tax havens and secrecy jurisdictions. This massive tax cheating by wealthy individuals and enterprises not only penalizes ordinary taxpayers, public finances, and social spending, but also threatens good governance, macroeconomic stability, and social cohesion. Mr. Speaker, the report takes the view that offshore financial centers are widely perceived to have contributed to the financial crisis that emerged in 2007. The holding of vast funds in the secretive offshore centers enables financial institutions to hide vital information from governments, regulators, rating agencies, and the public. This means that they escape proper regulation and public scrutiny. This enables them to take a greater risk than would be possible with full transparency. And governments, regulators, rating agencies, and investors lack the level of information required to make informed decisions. In turn, this leads to financial instability, with taxpayers having to cover the cost of rectifying the resulting problems. They believe that the use of tax havens for transfer pricing and tax evasion has a negative impact on the EU revenues by reducing the gross national income of member states. Moreover, lower tax revenues are likely to have a negative impact on the willingness of member states to increase or maintain their contributions to the EU. Tax havens facilitate the activities of tax evaders and criminal organizations. Combating these activities consume resources that could otherwise be used for productive investments. The ability to engage in transfer pricing gives large corporations a significant advantage over small companies, which undermines the EU's efforts to develop the small and medium-sized enterprise sectors and may constrain employment creation. Mr. Speaker, in light of the above, Bermuda is unfairly deemed to be on the EU's blacklist. Consequently, despite our continued engagement with the Commission and the Code of Conduct Group and its constructive and cordial relationships with its relevant officials, in principle, nothing has really changed for Bermuda since 2013. We continue to have an uphill battle when conducting business in the EU, especially after Brexit. That fact is, Mr. Speaker, that Bermuda has no heavyweight friends or influencers who can successfully lobby on our behalf at the national and international levels. If the EU takes the view that tax havens have a negative impact on EU revenues by reducing gross national income of its member states, Bermuda will be looked upon with suspicion and will be challenged to conduct real business in the EU. It will continue to place hurdles in our economic lanes, given their perception of tax havens and the impact on the EU states. In fact, Mr. Speaker, as recently as last month, the European Union politicians were calling for any jurisdictions with a 0% tax rate on corporate profits, including Bermuda, to be included on the EU list of non-cooperative jurisdictions. What makes this even more challenging, as our finance minister has indicated, is that the body that makes the list has given no indication of changes in the listing criteria. Mr. Speaker, Bermuda should form a strategic alliance with members listed on the EU's blacklist. They should form an alliance with influential lobbyists, NGOs, and other influencers that work within the European Parliament and its states. In so doing, this alliance can leverage its collective economic power, it can leverage its global influence, and its contributions to the international financial markets. Bermuda 2021-22 Economy and Budget. This blueprint is it provides very little hope and is likely the most non-specific budget statement. It is as though the onset of COVID pandemic was viewed as a get-out-of-car deal to dismiss the economic challenges facing Bermuda that were in existence prior to the pandemic. Mr. Speaker, the purpose of the budget statement is to give the public two specific things. One, a report and the government's finances for the past fiscal year within the overarching external conditions and government objectives. Two, it will provide the government's plans for the country for the next fiscal year and how those plans will affect government's revenues, expenditures, and balance sheet. Mr. Speaker, The Minister of Finance has failed to deliver either one of those objectives in any kind of robust or detailed fashion. Instead, he has merely listed off a number of issues facing the country without any specific plan as to how to meet these challenges. There is virtually no analysis or context other than COVID-19 of government's financial performance. What is being produced is a list of principles, but even that was poorly executed because the list is only a mixture of principles and objectives. For example, combating COVID-19 is an objective. Reducing the cost of living is an objective. Fairness and equity are principles. Fiscal prudence is a principle. Mr. Speaker, COVID-19 pandemic transcends national borders through aviation, ground transportation, and shipping. The social and economic impact is the same. As we all have seen, as the COVID-19 numbers spike, the health of our population becomes more challenged. As populations isolate and quarantines increase, economic confidence declines, business sales declines, unemployment increases, furloughs increases, homes are lost, loans become unserviceable, and the contraction of various businesses and economies continues. This is the story around the world. From a health perspective, Bermuda's economic recovery is admirable, and the Bermuda government should be commended for the work they've done and the work they continue to do. In fact, the Pan American Health Organization and the U.S. Center for Disease Control at one point raised the island's country status from clusters of COVID-19 cases to sporadic cases in recognition for the success that our country has achieved in containing the pandemic. In light of this, all Bermudians must continue to make their personal contribution if we are to minimize the health devastation left in the wake of COVID-19. The mitigation measures include social distancing, self-isolation, quarantining, hand washing, using personal protective equipment, and adhering to standards prescribed by the World Health Organization, TOCA, and the U.S. Center for Disease Control and other agencies. Mr. Speaker, as a well-known fiscal responsibility panel economist said, if you have a healthy and productive population, you will also have a more productive economy. Mr. Speaker, despite the above, the fact still remains that Bermuda's economy continues to contract, given that our 2020 gross domestic product is projected to fall by 7 to 9%. Mr. Speaker, what the reduction of GDP means for Bermuda is more jobs for Bermudians, especially small businesses, which play a vital role in the Bermuda's economic engine. In retail sector, businesses such as beauty salons, fitness-related facilities, and businesses within the hospitality sector will continue to bear the brunt of job losses. Apparel stores and service stations will continue to decline. These businesses face the threat of closure due to the added COVID-19 restrictions placed on them. They will likely not be able to pay their overhead costs, rents, and other expenses due to the dramatic decline in revenues. Low-wage earners who clean, prepare, and serve food within the private and public sectors are also significantly impacted. They will experience the most job redundancies and will be hit with increasing unemployment. For those who keep their jobs, they likely will not have a wage increase for years or are faced with reduced working hours. Tourism was catastrophically affected by COVID-19. Our cruise ship industry has all but vanished. with the related revenues down approximately 19% for 2020. The construction industry will continue to suffer as Bermuda's construction projects fell by 41.3% for the first 6 months of fiscal year 2021, and there is no relief on the horizon. Mr. Speaker, despite this status, economically, Bermuda must place its economy on a path of higher productivity and growth, while ensuring that benefits are shared evenly and that our debt is manageable. This is not an easy task, as other countries find it difficult to have trade-offs between implementing measures to support economic expansion and avoiding a further build-up of debt. There are those who believe that investments in health, education, and high-return infrastructure projects will also help move the country forward to a green economy. Research spending can facilitate innovation and technology adoption, which are the primary drivers of long-term productivity growth. Others believe that we cannot spend or grow our economy without extending our workforce or population. Mr. Speaker, we should also cooperate with other countries and regulators on the design of international corporate taxation to respond to the challenges of the digital economy. With the continued uncharted path of the pandemic, Bermuda must ensure that our healthcare can continue to cope with its demands. This means that we should continue to secure adequate resources, prioritize healthcare spending as needed, including testing, contract tracing, personal protective equipment, life-saving equipment such as ventilators, and facilities, such as emergency rooms, intensive care units, and isolation wards. Considering the above, Bermuda must continue to fight to contain the pandemic, which can be implemented by adopting measures to lower its transmission and set the stage for an eventual economic recovery due to mobility constraints. We should also limit the damage by supporting earnings losses for the affected people and firms. Retraining and reskilling of Bermudians should continue to the extent that is feasible, so that workers can look for jobs in other sectors. As this transaction may take some time, displaced workers need extended income support as they retrain and search for jobs. Mr. Speaker, we believe that as we reopen, our government must support the recovery by gradually removing targeted support, facilitating the reallocation of workers and resources to sectors less affected by social distancing, and providing stimulus where needed and to the extent possible. Some physical resources freed from targeted support should be redeployed to public investment, including in renewable energy, improving efficiency of the power transmission, and retrofitting buildings to reduce their carbon footprint. Moreover, as lifelines are unwound, social spending should be expanded to protect the most vulnerable. And where gaps exist in the safety net, authorities could enhance paid family and sick leave, expand eligibility for unemployment benefits, and strengthen healthcare benefit coverage as needed. Creating a nimble government. Mr. Speaker, as stated in the Sage Commission report, when comparing the size of Bermuda's government with other jurisdictions, and when tracking its growth during the past 20 years, the Sage Commission believed that Bermuda's government is disproportionately larger than it needs to be to conduct its business and to deliver necessary services to taxpayers. Currently, there are 36 members of the House of Assembly, 11 senators, 12 ministers, 72 departments, 13 quasi-non-governmental organizations, 16 related entities, and approximately 5,070 employees. Additionally, our multi-layered management structure and excessive decentralization has led to unnecessary red tape, poor communications, and delayed decision-making. Bermuda has a disproportionate number of paid legislators when compared to many other countries. As our elected and appointed representatives address the island's economic challenges, the SAGE Commissions believe that Bermuda had an opportunity to demonstrate their belief that the sacrifice needed to regain Bermuda's financial footing must be shared by all. Mr. Speaker, it's important to note that while the SAGE report was written 7 years ago, its recommendations are as workable today as they were when the report was first written. For example, the Commission recommended that the cost of running the Bermuda legislature could be reduced by 15%. In the first instance, the Commission recommended that the House of Assembly should be reduced from 36 to 30 seats. Secondly, they recommended that the size of the cabinet should be reduced to a maximum of 8 members, including the Premier. These reductions represent savings in salaries and benefits. The Premier can carry out the reduction in the size of the cabinet now. Until both recommendations are implemented, the SAGE Commission recommended that the ministers and members of the legislature take an immediate reduction in salary equal to the reduction in salaries and wages of the civil and public service. And as the cost savings do not equal the target 15%, the Commission recommended that the remaining areas of the legislature's budget should be reduced to make up the difference, and or make further reductions in the salary of the members and ministers of the legislature. Mr. Speaker, let's be clear. While some of these recommendations have been actioned, we believe that these recommendations can serve to demonstrate to the Bermuda community that our parliamentarians are serious about addressing the chronic debt crisis. Moreover, and that the leadership should lead by example, starting at the top. The Commission further recommended the following reductions to the organizational structure of the government. Ministries, as I said earlier, from 12 to a maximum of 8. Departments from 72 to 52. Prangers from 13 to 12. Organizations where government has administrative responsibility from 9 to 8. Now I'll move to the next topic, Mr. Speaker. Reliance on the One Bermuda Alliance capital projects helps boost the current economy. Mr. Speaker, for over the past 3 years, there has been a reliance on several OBA projects to materially boost Bermuda's GDP and create jobs. Unfortunately, we have not seen any meaningful action to manifest the promises made by the PLP. The reality is the promises made by the PLP have been broken. In its 2020 election platform, the PLP pledged to a target return to a balanced budget within 3 years, within 3 fiscal years, when tourism was fully recovered following the pandemic. They made repeated promises to balance the pre-pandemic budget and have failed. In fact, as recently as February 3rd of this year on the television broadcast, Minister of Finance indicated that he hoped to have a balanced budget by 2023. How exactly will this happen? Where is the detailed plan? Why should we believe them this time? Indeed, with the ongoing effects of COVID-19 and with no detailed plan to resurrect our economy, it appears that Bermuda is destined to further increase the size of our national debt, which is well on its way to almost $4 billion. A debt of that size will undoubtedly cripple our ability to put money where it is most needed, which is into social support networks, into stopping violence and into improving healthcare and the well-being of Bermudians, especially as debt servicing is costing us $127.8 million per year. Mr. Speaker, the One Bermuda Alliance stands by its economic policies. We know that it suits the naysayers to play down our achievements, but our efforts were nothing short of an economic miracle. Mr. Speaker, on our watch, world-class events came to the island. New hotels and a new airport was created. It created wealth and new jobs for Bermudians. And the OBA attracted $1 billion of inward investment to Bermuda. While those were some of the OBA's accomplishments to make it to the headlines, the OBA did so much more. Mr. Speaker, we created the Bermuda Tourism Authority, and under its leadership, Bermuda had seen rapid tourism arrivals. Now that it has been politicized, will we see the same level of success? Recognizing the need to bring more tourists to Bermuda during the shoulder season, we worked with the BTA to bring events such as the World Triathlon Series to the island. We negotiated a deal to bring 12 cruise ships to the Old Town of St. George's from 2017 to 2022. Under the agreement with Norwegian Cruise Lines, NCL agreed to bring 2 new catamaran ferries to the island for a run from Dockyard to the East End, along with a yearly investment of $150 million by NCL to sponsor tourism enhancement products and projects. Mr. Speaker, on the OBA's watch, we created the Bermuda Business Development Agency to help bring new businesses to Bermuda. And long before the PLP, we were exploring the opportunity of outer space when we began discussions with NASA of a more permanent facility at Cooper's Island. Further, we granted a 15-year exclusive contract to develop Bermuda's satellite slot. Aware of the need for sustainability and to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels, it was the OBA who started the process of getting a solar photovoltaic project on the finger at the F. Wade International Airport. Mr. Speaker, the small electric rental cars we now see on Bermuda's roads today were a result of legislation that the OBA passed, allowing rental mini cars in Bermuda for the first time in our history. As a result, there are now at least 4 rental businesses providing safer transportation for visitors and jobs for Bermudians. Mr. Speaker, Caroline Bay. Mr. Speaker, Morgan's Point has been a prominent place in the budget statement. And consequently, I will share some history with the people of Bermuda on this matter. Morgan's Point was a poison chalice almost from the start. How so, you would question? The ground was poisoned by the US Navy, and the contract that was signed by the previous PLP government with Morgan's Point Limited was poisoned by the obligation to clean up the entire site to a residential 1 standard at government's cost and the Bermuda taxpayers' cost. As the project progressed, the developer threatened to sue the then government for $100 million if they did not comply with the development agreement. Mr. Speaker, after long and difficult negotiations, government agreed to clean up the sections of the site where cleanup was possible and retain for itself the areas where it was impossible. We did that at a cost of approximately $30 million. Notwithstanding all of this, it was still a brownfield, and as such, investment funding would not be forthcoming without government's guarantee. To lay the infrastructure for the long-term future of our tourism industry, create opportunities for local businesses and jobs for Bermuda, the decision was made to guarantee certain loans for the project. Unfortunately, the project failed. Nevertheless, despite the negative result of this case, government guarantees are generally required from overseas financiers to finance major projects in Bermuda. Mr. Speaker, the question is, what now? The government has said plenty of time to formulate a plan for the future of Morgan's Point. What is the plan? We were hoping that this would be articulated in the budget statement. I have to say that it is disappointing not to see the plan in the statement. Mr. Speaker, while on the topic of Carolina Bay, what happened with the Morgan's Point liquidation? What did the government actually receive for the $165 million expended for the adoption of the loans? Again, the Minister of Finance has been thrifty with these details. Business confidence. Mr. Speaker, to contrast the OBA's accomplishment under the PLP leadership, Bermuda has seen the lowest business confidence level ever. New and increased taxes have significantly impacted small Bermudian businesses who can least afford it. And we have seen the implosion of retail businesses as well as the loss of hundreds of jobs in the sector, which was described by one minister as insignificant. It is important to note that none of these casualties were as a result of COVID-19. Agonizingly, we have seen Bermuda's debt rise by $1 billion in 12 months, which is absolutely incredible. Mr. Speaker, there have always been little progress in gaming, and an untendered deal for an arbitration center for which no financial details have been provided. Gaming. Mr. Speaker, there has been no mention of gaming in the 2021 budget statement. In the past 2 or 3 years, the topic of gaming has been very popular, as it is an amenity which can support our ever-evolving tourism industry. We note in the budget that there is a 125% increase in the Cabinet Office, where the government's gaming infrastructure is managed. Is this extra $21.69 million allocation for the gaming industry? Mr. Speaker, the Gaming Commission has issued 2 provisional licenses to 2 world-class resorts, and these resorts are unable to move forward with their gaming offering because the proper legislative and operational framework is not in place. Moreover, the banking component of the structure has not been resolved, even though we are making progress in this space. Mr. Speaker, I've been advised that the delay in the gaming lies at the feet of the Premier, and that the banking matter can be resolved if the Premier does what he's supposed to do. Mr. Speaker, there are those who have vast experience in the gaming industry who believe the gaming should be removed from the Premier and Cabinet Office portfolio and transferred to the Minister of Finance. Senior international bankers also have indicated that they are not aware of any advanced nation where gaming is under the control of or under the purview of a country's head of state, i.e. Premier, Prime Minister, or President. In addition, there are stakeholders who believe that the overarching Gaming Commission legislation must be amended so that the Commission is independent of government influence and interference. These should include the removal of the requirement that a government representative sit on the board of the Commission. In fact, it was noted that the Gaming Commission should have the same type of independence and autonomy as the Bermuda Monetary Authority. As in most As most in our country are aware, the current government has indicated that operationally, Bermuda will be progressing with a cashless gaming solution. What does a cashless gaming solution mean? Are we talking about credit cards only? Are we talking about cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, Ethereum, Tether, through blockchain solutions? Transparency is required, as potential operators who are prepared to invest in this industry are not clear on government's cashless gaming direction. This matter must be resolved soon, especially as a new hotel will be launched before this summer. Considering the above, we must get it right, as government has a responsibility to fulfill its obligations as prescribed under the various hotel development agreements which are in place in our tourism industry. International business. Bermuda's international business has continued to tick over well despite COVID-19. And the new capital is coming into our market. Many of Bermuda's major carriers have already raised $12 billion in new capital, according to the chairman of and CEO of Arch Worldwide Reinsurance Group. Most of this new capital went to existing companies, and approximately $2 billion went into new companies. With this infusion in existing and new companies, Bermuda will see the multiplier effect. However, while much needed capital is coming to the island, the new landscape will not be similar to previous landscapes. Companies are now outsourcing many of their back office functions to jurisdictions outside of Bermuda. IT services have been relocated overseas. Employees are working remotely from Canada, the UK, the US, and Europe. More and more administrative work is being outsourced to more competitive jurisdictions, and business analytic models are being purchased off the shelves, thereby robbing our people of job opportunities and employment. Considering the above, Mr. Speaker, our job as parliamentarians is to encourage such companies to fill their positions locally. This can be accomplished by making the immigration process more accommodating and by removing some of the bureaucratic red tape which stymies a productive and welcoming business environment. We cannot afford to lose this momentum, as it is the only tailwind that we currently have. Mr. Speaker, we must encourage government to get out of the way and allow Bermuda to grow. In 2018, Bermuda hosted an event that is being referred to as the Davos of Ocean Science. It is time now that we consider hosting a similar Ocean Risk Summit, an event for climate change risk. In so doing, Mr. Speaker, Bermuda can reposition herself to also be the center of excellence for an international climate change risk market. Digital commerce. Mr. Speaker, quite a lot is also being said about the tangible opportunities in the digital commerce arena in Bermuda, and the One Bermuda Alliance supports this discussion. With Bermuda's legislative, regulatory, and telecommunications framework and digital communications infrastructure, we stand ready to capitalize on the emerging and growing industry. We expect the provision of robust training and internship programs and the creation of new jobs for Bermudians. In addition, from a taxation perspective, the digital sector will provide benefits from the taxation schemes currently in place in Bermuda, such as company taxes, payroll taxes, and land taxes. The government should consider further examination of a negotiated value-added tax for the privilege of booking their local and global internet business earnings from Bermuda. This approach is not new, and the industry is familiar with it. According to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, in the absence of a new international rule book, similar member governments are planning their own digital service taxes. They are taking this action because of growing public pressure on multinationals like Google, Facebook, and Amazon to pay their share under international tax rules after COVID-19 strained national budgets. Base rates. Mr. Speaker, the government's recent throne speech indicated that the legislature will be invited to consider bills to reform banking laws and regulations and to establish a Bermuda-based interest rate. It goes on to say that the reform of banking laws will increase competition in this section, introduce new classes of banks to boost the economy, and harmonize the bank base rate, while at the same time working with banks to reduce the interest rates charged on mortgages. Mr. Speaker, here I will declare my interest. I am a banker. Mr. Speaker, before the government embarks upon this journey, may I suggest that the government build consensus with the Bermuda Banking Association, and that also it secures the blessings and support of the Banking Association members. I'm saying this because of the unintended consequences. The reality is that there are two large international banks on the island, which likely provides approximately 65 to 70% of Bermuda's loans and mortgages. If they are not on board with government proposals, and if they prescribed base rate impacts their earnings and return on assets, then the same banks will stealthily exercise their option and will quietly and drastically reduce their mortgage and loan portfolio footprint in Bermuda. They can redeploy their assets and the availability of loans and mortgages to their other branches or subsidiaries in other jurisdictions. In simple terms, if we do not get this right, the availability of mortgages and loans to Bermudians will decrease exponentially, and the bank's assets will be used to support the rapid growth of their mortgage and loan footprints in other jurisdictions such as Cayman, Bahamas, BVI, Jersey, Guernsey, the US, and the UK. Mr. Speaker, I reiterate, we must be aware of the unintended consequence, as this move may come back to bite us. Immigration. Immigration reform has been a thorny and very emotional issue for successive governments of Bermuda and her people. It has been a political football, and with the aid of successive PLP governments, this issue has stoked civil unrest. But despite the above, Progressive Labour Party has begun to make progress in this space. Their government is just beginning to recognize that Bermuda's workforce and population must expand. Mr. Speaker, the PLP government is finally accepting the fact that a good immigration policy is a good economic policy. Mr. Speaker, 2 weeks ago, the Minister of Immigration introduced the Economic Investment Certificate and the Residential Certificate policy, which enable investors to apply for the right to live in Bermuda indefinitely on the condition that they invest a minimum of $2.5 million into the economic well-being of Bermuda, which will add value to our economy. Mr. Speaker, Bermuda also has approved applications for 400 digital nomads who are also welcome. But how many have actually moved to Bermuda under this residential program? For years, the OBA tried to revise the current Immigration Act, but we could not do so because of civil unrest in our community. And today, the Progressive Labour Party is finally seeing the light. A good immigration policy is a good economic policy. Mr. Speaker, we are seeing the promotion of several reforms that the One Bermuda Alliance recommended, especially with mixed status families, as well as the idea of commercial immigration, which was initially presented by the former OBA Immigration Minister, the Honorable Michael Fay, JPMP. Quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, we also know that a full review of the Immigration Act of 1956 is a must. It's draconian, dated, and well over 60 years old. Its original purpose and features are no longer relevant to the Bermuda we enjoy today. It just does not support our 21st century economy with all its nuances and challenges. Considering the above, our current government must grab the proverbial nettle, stop the political sophistry, and embark upon an immigration review that will help to expand Bermuda's workforce, and in turn will form the foundation of Bermuda's economic growth. It will also create a pathway to residency and citizenship, while at the same time protect the interests of Bermudians and Bermudian jobs. Based on Rocher Sharma's 10 Rules of Successful Nations, increasing the population has accounted for roughly half of economic growth, and that if population is shrinking, it is close to impossible to generate strong economic growth. As the European Commission stated in 2005, never in history has there been economic growth without population growth. Mr. Speaker, for the edification of our country, let me explain why the expansion of our workforce is crucial. Debt service, and deficit. More working people in Bermuda means greater payroll tax collection and more local consumption, which increases customs duties. A greater residential population creates a multiplier effect on our two biggest buckets of tax. Healthcare costs. Guest workers are generally younger and healthier than our average resident. Increasing the number of guest workers massively improves the sustainability of our healthcare system. Aging population. Increasing working age population with all else staying the same directly reduces our maintenance ratio. Total healthcare costs and aging population are closely intertwined. Global compliance requirements. Many companies are going to have to do more to justify their presence in Bermuda under the new tax regimes. We are competing with other jurisdictions on this front and must present a welcoming attitude. Narrow economy. More working age people on the island decrease the tax load per person. Mr. Speaker, keeping it real, our economy, social wellness, and security are inextricably linked with immigration, more so than any other jurisdiction. We are a service economy with no physical exports and only two pillar industries. one which produces much of our foreign exchange, employment, and tax revenues, i.e. international business. It is time that the immigration review must start, and it must start now. Immigration reform just makes good business sense. Pensions for investment. Mr. Speaker, once again, the Minister of Finance is silent when it comes to the unfunded liability for our Public Service Superannuation Fund, the Government Health Insurance Fund, and the members of the Legislature and Ministerial Fund. For the record, it stands at approximately $1.47 billion based on the latest Auditor General's report. Will our government employees have a pension that they can draw on when they retire in the years to come? Mr. Speaker, this question is not unreasonable, given that the total liability due to our pension plan participants and government note holders now stands at $4.7 billion. Mr. Speaker, if we are going to be truly transparent, we should note that our government funded some of their stimulus programs on the back of pension plans, pension holidays, which only kick the can further down the road. Here it should also be noted that the superannuation fund shortfalls are of course funded through the consolidated fund. Need to be addressed at some point. Additional capital development spending. The third speech indicates that under normal circumstances, governments the world over increases their capital expenditure to stimulate the economy and create projects to help to get its citizens back to work after natural disasters and dramatic economic downturns. But these are not normal times, with the government debt ceiling at $3.5 billion and no surplus budget possibilities in the near future. Mr. Speaker, the One Bermuda Alliance created an environment that incentivized foreign investment, such as the St. Regis Hotel and the Azure Bermuda Hotel. We engineered innovative public-private sector schemes, such as the airport, and promoted international events such as the America's Cup, which alone brought $350 million to our economy and stimulated jobs and commerce, representing a sizable return on the public purse spending. This present government has not demonstrated that type of ingenuity and prowess. Is capital development spending needed to now upgrade our infrastructure and to stimulate our state and economy? The answer is yes. Does this government have the ability to make this happen while adequately addressing its debt and at the same time not going into further debt and maintaining its present service levels while trimming the fat of the government spending? Past performance of this administration and the contents of his recent throne speech does not convince us that it can. Mr. Speaker, while on the topic of capital development, it should be noted that the One Bermuda Alliance recognizes the need for infrastructure development. When we were government, we implemented a number of large infrastructure projects, some successful and some were not. One that was not successful was the Fortress Bermuda Infrastructure Fund. This was the brainchild of Brian Duperreau and the Honorable E.T. Bob Richards. The idea was to create a for-profit investment fund to improve the infrastructure in Bermuda, funded by the reinsurance industry that has assets of $2/3 of $1 trillion. Yes, $1 trillion in investments outside of Bermuda. A number of ABR companies bought into the idea, and Fortress Investments of New York were to be hired to manage it. It was supposed to be about $250 million in size. But in the final analysis, in March 2017, the proposal realized firm commitments of only $66 million. And Fortress wanted $1 million per year in fees. We consequently declined that offer. However, after the the 2017 election, one of the first things Premier Burke did and his government did was to sign the same deal. As far as we know, government has paid Fortress $5 million for this infrastructure fund. Where do we stand today? What value has the country received for the $5 million payment to Fortress? Update taxation system. Mr. Speaker, the following speech proposes that the Tax Reform Commission of 2018 should update its recommendations in light of the new economic realities created by the pandemic. Mr. Speaker, our question to this government is, have they read the 2019 report? And if they've read the report, what have they done thus far to implement these recommendations? We submit that there are recommendations found in the report that are fair and equitable. They do not place undue burden on the lower paid workers of this country, and which do a lot to effectively broaden the tax base without stifling the economy. But like the SAFE report, the Fiscal Responsibility Panel report, and other similar reports, this government apparently has no appetite for them, nor have they put into practice recommendations made by these commissioners. Revised tax structure. Speaker, the Financial Responsibility Panel recommends that the country should brace itself for a revised tax structure. The panel feels that the current tax structure is unsustainable in addressing Bermuda's current economy. In real terms, this may mean more taxes for the people of Bermuda, given that they believe that a reasonable tax revenue as a percentage of GDP should be around 19 to 20%. That will be an increase of approximately $190 million over 3 years. In addition, it should be noted that with the imminent embodiment of the Tax Reform Committee, a more fair and equitable tax structure is being examined, which could result in an increase in all of our current personal tax liabilities. Mr. Speaker, the bottom line is that we need enough taxes to run government and no more. Without taxes, we cannot effectively run government. Government accounts receivables. Mr. Speaker, it should also be noted that this current budget has not addressed the government's $100 million account receivable portfolio realized from across all government ministries. Neither did they present any management strategies, write-off strategies, or recovery strategies. In today's environment, this government should not and cannot entertain any suggestion of implementing overdue tax amnesties or tax forgiveness for delinquent taxpayers who meet certain eligibility requirements. This is a slap in the face for those taxpayers who have been diligent, made sacrifices, and found the wherewithal to pay their bills when they come due. Some who may not have had the money to pay their bills and to arrange payment plans to ensure that they meet their commitments. In some instances, if a company needed work permits, such work permits were withheld until the delinquent accounts were made current. To forgive those who just did not bother to pay or to enter into payment plans will establish a precedent whereby responsible companies will hold on to their money with the view of waiting out the time to get a write-off. Bermuda's national debt. Bermuda's national debt continues to rise unabated. As I mentioned earlier this year, Bermuda can expect that our national debt will hover around $4 billion during the next fiscal year. The Minister of Finance is rightfully concerned. Indeed, we all should be very concerned. He indicated that the government's budget deficit is expected to be an unsustainable $245 million for the year 2021 after the COVID pandemic, with slashed revenues and soaring expenditures. If we continue this glide path, we will see another increase in Bermuda's debt ceiling. Fiscal Responsibility Panel said in their 2020 report that an adverse, but far more inconceivable scenario would see government debt on an unsustainable trajectory, leading to a credit rating downgrade and higher interest rates on new debt, the risk of large emergency tax increases and spending cuts, and the possibility of capital flight and foreign exchange crisis. The FRP also indicated that given the fiscal position and the limited progress of the government acting on either of their earlier recommendations, they are concerned that Bermuda will have little fiscal or macroeconomic policy bandwidth to address any crystallization of these risks. Over the long term, their key concern is still domestic, i.e., the island's shrinking workforce and aging population. This challenge will put ever-increasing pressure on both taxes and spending. Mr. Speaker, according to the Fiscal Responsibility Panel, the issue is not whether action is needed or even what actions are needed. There is already a high degree of consensus in both their reports and those of other independent bodies, and indeed within government, that action is needed now. This action includes immigration reform, tax reform, and changes to the structure of healthcare and pensions, which are all necessary. Debt service. Mr. Speaker, Bermuda's annual debt service is completely under control. This money is paid to our local and international bondholders. For the year ending March 31st, 2021, the annual expense will total approximately $127 million, or approximately 11.4% of the estimated expenditures. This expense is the third largest government expense after the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Health. It is almost larger than the Ministry of Youth, Sports, and Community Affairs, Social Development and Seniors, and the Ministry of Home Affairs, the Ministry of Transport combined. And Mr. Speaker, most of this money leaves Bermuda and does not circulate in our economy for further use by our people. The sinking fund. Mr. Speaker, the current budget statement indicates that the Minister of Finance plans to finance its deficit from the sinking fund. The Royal Gazette stated that the sinking fund was devised by the late David Soul for a rainy day, just like this one. Mr. Speaker, for clarity, Bermuda should note that the sinking fund was set up specifically to provide for the retirement of debt. In fact, the annual contribution was earmarked annually at 2.5% of the outstanding debt for the expiring fiscal year. What will the Progressive Labour Party government policy be going forward? Will the sinking fund contributions be made in times of plenty when we have current account surplus? Will the suspension of our contributions to the sinking fund be permanently on the table, or will the suspension be temporary? How are we going to establish a reserve to retire the growing debt which Bermuda faces as a result of Progressive Labour Party governments? Speaker, it should also be noted that the Bermuda Alliance amended this policy slightly so that when we could raise large, cheap borrowings, we would place the excess in the sinking fund and take it out as needed. It was not intended to mix the money set aside for debt repayment with excess borrowed money for operations. But that, Mr. Speaker, is exactly what is taking place. Income tax. Mr. Speaker, income tax recently became a topical issue in Bermuda, especially when it comes to addressing economic inequality. Mr. Speaker, as my friend and former political colleague and former Minister of Finance, Honorable E.T. Bob Bridges, indicated, and I quote, "The United States and Britain have had a system of income tax for over 100 years, yet income equality is still a significant issue there. In a recent study of the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, which has 37 member countries, the U.S. was the fourth highest in terms of income inequality. Britain was the fifth highest. In the U.S., the top 1% earns 38% of the entire country's income. The income gap has widened over the past 40 years. A Pew Research study showed that in 1968, the top 20% earned 40% of the nation's income, while in 2018, the top 20% earned 52% of the nation's income. Across the Atlantic, it is said that there are more billionaires in Britain per capita than any other developed country in the world. Billionaire Warren Buffett once said that his secretary paid a higher percentage in tax on her income than he did. So much so for tax promoting income equality. That premise in the real world is patently false. Mr. Speaker, legislating income tax is easy. Collecting income tax is another matter. The structure of Bermuda's private sector creates a peculiar challenge in collecting income taxes. Take dividends, for example. If I own 100 shares of Bank of Butterfield, the dividend will be paid to me and there would be a clear audit trail if I fail to declare it as income. But most local businesses are privately held, family-owned enterprises. In such cases, it would be easy in a myriad of ways to extract a return on your capital without paying a dividend. Mr. Speaker, the cost of collecting such passive income will be enormous. In a large country, that cost can be spread over millions of taxpayers, but not in Bermuda. You would have to swell the civil service just to attempt to collect such taxes. But wealthy people have the resources to hire tax professionals to mitigate their tax burden, while the average and poor people do not. In Bermuda, a balance must be struck between levying taxes and the cost of collecting taxes, and the cost of doing business in Bermuda, and the cost of living in Bermuda. Mr. Richards' enlightened remark speaks volumes on the implementation of income tax to correct inequities. To summarize, Bermuda should measure twice and cut once, as income tax is not the panacea for addressing economic inequality in Bermuda. Yearly deficits in millions. Mr. Speaker, I can recall back in 2010 when the OBA became government and had to borrow money to pay for the ongoing expenses to run the government. Money had to be borrowed as there was massive inherited debt while stimulus program took effect. Government spending was reduced gradually in an effort to avoid mass redundancies of civil servants. The OBA determined that the debt ceiling was required to clean up the mess and set a $2.5 billion cap. The OBA inherited a machine running an operational deficit of $100 million and an overall deficit of $219 million in 2012-2013. The OBA handed over a government running an operational surplus of $166 million and an overall deficit of $8 million, excluding the sinking fund contribution in 2017-18. The debt was being significantly addressed. Mr. Speaker, for those honorable members wishing to take political points with the debt, it is worth noting that during the last fiscal years of the PLP government, i.e. 2008-9 to 2012-13, the debt grew by 320% from $335 million to $1.48 billion. From the start of the times of plenty in 2001 until the year of election in 2012, the debt has grown by 1,045%, or 11 times over. Mr. Speaker, it would be remiss if I did not acknowledge the comments made by Bermuda's Auditor General for Bermuda's national debt. She underscored her concern by stating that, as in her previous reports, the government continues to make decisions without knowing the combined financial position of all the organizations that make up the government's reporting entity. She further added there was no effective, comprehensive long-term plans for reducing the annual and accumulated deficits or associated debt. The unfunded liabilities of his major pension plans are the size of taxpayer indebtedness, all of which continue to grow unsustainably. Mr. Speaker, this continued behavior must stop, and fiscal prudence should and must be addressed if we are going to bring our national debt into check. It is time to introduce fiscal responsibility legislation, which places a ceiling on the annual expenditure growth. Do we also have a place of an added feature which places a ceiling on our debt to GDP ratio? This should not be dismissed, as our debt service is close to 60% of our GDP, and each Bermudian worker is carrying $133,000 of the government debt. Healthcare. Mr. Speaker, the One Bermuda Alliance believes that all Bermudians should have access to affordable, high-quality healthcare. Through true and transparent consultation, the OBA recommends that government work with all sectors involved in the delivery and financing of healthcare in Bermuda to reduce the cost of healthcare, tackle chronic illness, and ensure equal access to care. Every Bermudian has the right to health insurance coverage that is evidence-based and managed by independent professionals and not by the government. The legislation surrounding healthcare is fragmented, and we recommend that laws are brought up to date and unified to reduce the confusion surrounding our healthcare regulations. The supplemental benefit of the mental health needs to be regulated and protected to ensure that insureds are being covered at the same level as medical benefits. All of our people need more access to information about their healthcare policies, to have clear transparency regarding to the specifics of their coverage. We also recommend that the PLP government implement a unique patient identifier for everyone in Bermuda. This will ensure that everyone has coverage, reduce duplication of services, and drive down the cost of healthcare for all. It will assist in services being streamlined and produce a true number to those who are uninsured or underinsured, and to assist in developing solutions to reduce this subset of the population. But Mr. Speaker, we must do more to tackle the root causes of poor health. So the One Bermuda Alliance recommends a national physical fitness program to ensure well-being, sound health, exercise, healthy diets from primary school throughout life. We would also recommend that the introduction of a program that specifically targets non-communicable diseases, underpinned with food cost reductions for healthy living, aging population, and its impact on Bermuda. Mr. Speaker, according to Bermuda's Department of Statistics, Bermuda's population projections, 2016 to 2026, as baby boomers age over the coming years, more persons will be reaching the retirement age than in the past. Due to declining fertility rates, it may be difficult for employers to ensure enough qualified young Bermudians to fill their vacant posts. Also, as indicated by the increasing old age dependency ratio, there will be a greater proportion of elderly dependents who may need to be supported by the working population. One possible solution to address this would be to increase the mandatory retirement age of 65 in some industries, or to eliminate it altogether, as an earlier retirement age diminishes the labor pool. Aside from this substantial immigration, another way to increase the labor supply immediately will be to bring more of the elderly into the workforce. In the future, the needs of the elderly will likely shift public policy and the provision of services. Finding affordable care providers for seniors could become more challenging than finding child care providers. More or larger retirement facilities, senior citizens daycare programs, and in-home care services will also be required. As a result, Bermuda's growing population will mean added challenges in upcoming years. Again, Mr. Speaker, to remedy this situation, we need to expand our workforce. We need more local jobs so that we are able to collect the revenue to fund our pensions and care for our seniors. Resources needed for chronic health conditions. Mr. Speaker, the population projection report also states that all residents, 72%, 7.2% were 75 years older in 2016. By 2026, this proportion is anticipated to increase to 10.8%. The increase in the proportion of older seniors will likely increase the demand for purpose-built residential facilities with trained staff. This is inevitable, as with increasing age, seniors are more likely to have chronic health challenges that may require the assistance of another person or permanent care in an institution. Mr. Speaker, according to the 2010 consensus, 77% of seniors had a long-term health condition, compared to 35% of persons under the age of 65. Also, 14% of seniors had a disabling long-term health condition, in comparison to 4% of the population under 65 years of age. The 2014 health survey of adults in Bermuda indicated that seniors were more likely to have hypertension, diabetes, and cardiovascular diseases. Mr. Speaker, rising healthcare costs outpace inflation. In 2004, each Bermuda household spent $7,000 a year on healthcare, a 156% increase from the amount spent in 1993. This represents a greater increase in healthcare expenditure than the 32% rate of inflation during that similar period. The amount each household spent on healthcare was roughly $10,300 on average in 2013, a 47% increase from 2004. This was also a greater increase than the 30% rate of inflation during the period. In 2013, households headed by seniors spent $10,919 per year on household, up from $6,000 in 2004. 76% of the expenditure was comprised of health insurance. Mr. Speaker, the report indicates that Bermuda's healthcare system shares a gross domestic product is the third highest in the OECD. countries. This is of concern, as although this may reflect prioritization of health in an economy, it also highlights the need for improvement in health system efficiency. Employment. Mr. Speaker, as we review government finances and the state of our economy, it is shameful that this government does not have the latest employment statistics for 2020. Mr. Speaker, you may recall that the latest report was issued in September 2020 by the Cabinet Office under the leadership of the Honorable Wayne Furbert, JP, and that report referenced the week of April 25th to August 31st, 2019. The annual employment survey is a census of all business on the island and serves the purpose of providing a broad count of all filled jobs in the Bermuda labor market. That said, Mr. Speaker, our economic review indicated that 1,935 jobs were lost in 2020, which is a 5.6% reduction. Mr. Speaker, Bermuda's young people have been hit particularly hard by the labor market fallout from the coronavirus, with workers aged under 24 accounting for nearly half of the total fall in employment during the economic crisis. At the same time, there's a strong evidence that more people are chasing fewer jobs, so our young people are struggling to enter the employment market. Significantly, young people account for 46% of the overall fall in employment during the pandemic, even though they only account for just 1 in 9 in the workforce. What strategies and programs will this government establish to address this job loss glide path? Is it time to provide more resources to foster and support entrepreneurial opportunities? As a senior economist at the Bermuda College recently said, we need to support more young people who are working in the gig economy, which will be a significant part of the engine to drive our economy. Local retail sales. Mr. Speaker, when looking at the sales figure, it became very clear that consumer demand was stronger than ever. The demand straddled across all business sectors. When looking at the latest sales index figures, it became very clear that consumer demand was stronger than ever, as was evident in all sectors. This, we believe, was directly attributed to the coronavirus lockdown and the dramatic decline in non-essential overseas travel by our residents. People have more discretionary income and shop locally. They spend much less on travel and vacations overseas, and more was spent in Bermuda. We shop locally, we made minor renovations to our homes, we purchased new furniture and vehicles, and stocked up on essentials like groceries, toiletries, and beverages. Mr. Speaker, according to the Government Statistics Department, sales volumes increased 7.9% after adjusting for the sales rate of inflation, which was measured at 0.8% in October. The overall volume of retail sales increased 7.9% when compared to October 2019. This confirmed that the growth was attributed mostly to increased spending on the island by residents. In value terms, retail sales rose 8.8% to an estimated 99.5 million. 6 of the 7 retail sectors recorded higher sales volumes, with the motor vehicle recording the largest volume increase of 21%. Building materials were up by 5.15%. Service stations were up by 1%. Apparel stores were down by 11.9%. Food was up 7.2%. And liquor sales were up by 17.7%. Mr. Speaker, according to Minister Wayne Furbert, while the restrictions on travel had a significant limiting impact on local retail activity, they actually substantially boost selected overseas declarations, which are defined as declarations via courier, by residents via the airport, by households via sea, and via the Bermuda Post Office. The value of the total of those categories is seen as continuously increasing for the fifth consecutive month since May 2020, compared to August 2020. Overseas declarations in September had reported an increase of 6.6%. Tourism and hospitality. Mr. Speaker, according to a tourism economist and specialist, Adam Sachs, Bermuda's tourism industry will recover nearly fully from the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic by 2023. He stated that tourism in Bermuda will operate at 20% of 2019 levels in 2020. It will improve to 67% this year and reach 79% in 2022 and 94% 3 years from now. He said part of the strategy is survival in the 3-year period to get to this point. Mr. Sachs said he expects the first half of 2021 to be very difficult, but said the second half of the year will see an improvement. He said tourism accounted for 19% of the island's gross domestic product, nearly 1/5 of Bermuda's economic output, adding 20% of all jobs are directly and indirectly supported by the visitor economy. He further stated that Bermuda has reinvented itself and approached the market in innovative ways and has done it while staying true to who we are. He added that the loss of 80% of our tourism economy this year was a massive call to action to do all that we can from a policy and strategic standpoint to restore a central pillar of the Bermuda economy. Considering the above, Bermuda has shown steady improvement since the airport reopened in July 1, hitting 16.1% of the 2019 visitor volumes earlier this month. We still have a ways to go, but this will be challenged because of the recent spike in coronavirus in the east coast of the US, which is our core market. We should also support the industry by increasing the number of seats and flights available to visitors. We will also continue to position ourselves as one of the international COVID-19 safe havens. Mr. Sachs went on to indicate that the time is right, as a survey in the US showed that only 50% of American households felt safe traveling outside of their community. This was reflected in figures that showed that their air travel by Americans was at 1/3 to previous levels and is likely to increase in the coming months as studies show that air travel is relatively safe compared to other activities. While 11 million Americans remain out of work, he said the high-income earners were least affected by lost job losses. Those people, those high earners, are our customers. Mr. Speaker, despite this outlook, the government expects a poultry passenger tax of $4.5 million. The same principle applies to the transport infrastructure tax, which was allocated a negligible $2 million. This speaks to government's dismal outlook for 2021-22. Are they not listening to the professionals in the industry? Mr. Speaker, another feature that jumped out in the budget statement was the $10 million guarantee for the Bermuda Beach Hotel to support the second phase of its development. This is a philosophical turn around for the Minister of Finance, who thrashed the One Bermuda line for its hotel guarantee program. Education and Bermuda College. Mr. Speaker, the One Bermuda Alliance has long stated that the way forward for education is to have it overseen by an independent education authority. So we are delighted that the PLP finally sees the value that an education authority can bring to the delivery of education in Bermuda and student performance and outcomes. An education authority is not the cure, Mr. Speaker, but it is the first and necessary steps towards establishing a system that provides the foundation for our young people to succeed. We also recommend the establishment of a continuing professional development center for our teachers to enhance teaching skills and maintain high standards with continuous training support. It is also crucial that both teachers and students receive the support they need. So, Mr. Speaker, the One Bermuda Line urges the government to supplement schools with teams of foundational counselors to support our children and instill the skills needed for life, from early development learning to guidance in later years when children transition from education to working life. Government should protect the Bermuda College from the financial impact of the crisis so that it can maintain and enhance its critical role within our community and take decisive steps to align their teaching and learning provisions to meet business and employer needs. Mr. Speaker, in 2017, the Progressive Labor Party released its general election platform. In it, it pledged to reform public education by phasing out middle schools and introducing signature schools at the secondary level, with focus on learning styles and interests of our children, including academic, technical, and the trades, business, sports, arts, and the special needs education. Instead, now the focus is on primary schools. The government is expected to close 9 of the present 18 primary schools and replace them with parish primary schools, 1 in each parish except Pembroke, which will have 2. Under the plan, a new primary school will be built in Devonshire, with 2 existing primary schools to be converted into an alternative signature school and a replacement for the Dame Marjorie B. Pope Academy. This proposal to close half of Bermuda's primary schools was not mentioned in the 2017 election campaign. That is understandable, as it might not have been thought of, but surely it should have been mentioned in the 2020 PLP platform when the government sent Bermuda voters back to the polls. Mr. Speaker, it's sad to state, but this budget ironically has said very little about this educational structuring and the reconfiguration and redevelopment of our school campuses. In fact, there was an $8 million allocation reduction for the Department of Education. We look forward to an explanation for this reduction. Sports. Again, Mr. Speaker, there was no mention of sports in this budget report and the further development of our young people. In fact, it was noted that the Ministry of Youth, Cultural Affairs, and Sports headquarters had a reduction of 38% in allocation. Is this department not valued? Mr. Speaker, we all know that education and sports provides discipline, self-respect, responsibility, and growth to our young people. They are our future, and nothing was addressed in the budget to concentrate on the development of our young people. That this government spends resources on the development of cannabis industry with very little said by the ministry in support of our youth. The arts and creative sector. Given the significant contribution of the arts, culture, and creative industries to Bermuda's economy and our social fabric, the government should take steps to protect this sector and look for ways to increase public and private investment in the arts in Bermuda. The philanthropic sector. Mr. Speaker, the One Bermuda Alliance believes that government should take action to protect capacity and financial sustainability of the third sector in recognition of its important role in building and supporting Bermuda's social fabric. We should examine the scope for longer-term funding arrangements for social services which support our families, our seniors, and the development of our young people. There should be new initiatives to incentivize private investments into this section. In closing, Mr. Speaker, I would like to take a moment to once again acknowledge the sterling contributions of the late Fernandez, former financial secretary at the government of Bermuda. He was a force to be reckoned with and would have been an integral part of this budget process. His untimely death earlier this year is still having impact on all who knew and respected him. Finally, Mr. Speaker, the One Bermuda Alliance asserts that there is a way forward, but there is much work to be accomplished. From a health perspective, it starts with each one of us who call Bermuda home. We must continue to adhere to the COVID-19 protocols to ensure that not only are we safe as individuals, but the knock-on effect will also be a safe community, which bolsters our economy as tourism returns, business reopens, jobs are filled, and investors will return to our shore. Mr. Speaker, Bermuda has proven time and time again that we can weather the storm if we work together. The One Bermuda Alliance fervently believes that if Bermuda is to move forward from the darkness of the pandemic into the rays of hope which are just ahead of us, the issues outlined in this submission must be addressed. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honorable Member. Opposition Leader. Does any other member wish to speak?
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
Honorable Deputy Premier,
Yes, Mr.
we
Speaker.
recognize you, and you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you.
And once again, I'm happy to have the opportunity to participate in this budget debate for the 2021-2022 budget year. Without a doubt, this is a budget that comes on the edge of a historic, monumental period for Bermuda, a more different period than we have ever faced as a country. And certainly it is on the minds of everyone as to how the future will be shaped, certainly by the government and its own priorities and by the wider community and our many families and residents and those who consider Bermuda home. So this budget means much to many. It is not just about the government's expenditure, it's about the direction of the country. And so we entered into this economic debate today with all that as part of what we are here to discuss. But I must say, Mr. Speaker, and I won't spend too much time actually reflecting on the 2-hour presentation or close to 2-hour presentation that we just had in any detail. But I am clearly, with having had the exposure to this presentation, I understand the meaning of contrast and what that word means in definition. I understand the difference between a Model T Ford and a Tesla. I understand the difference between the Wright brothers plane that took off in Kitty Hawk and a 777 Boeing. I understand the difference between a sailing boat and a ocean liner or a modern cruise ship. I know the difference between building a grass hut and a modern skyscraper. There is great contrast that we see between the statement that was given today and the statement that was given last week. And I will kind of just stop there on that contrast, on that comment, Mr. Speaker, because I expect that my colleagues who will follow, members of the government team, will give their own take on not only what has been presented to us, but also what our government plans to do for the future. But I think it's important, Mr. Speaker, in the period that I had, and how much time do I have, Mr. Speaker, to do the presentation?
Members, the second speaker,
Just want to confirm.
the opening speaker had his time. You have, is it 30 minutes? Because
I just wanted to confirm what the rules are on it.
yeah.
Is it 30?
Yes, sir.
Okay, all right. I just wanted to confirm the rules, Mr. Speaker, so I can be sure. But I will just try and paint a picture for our listening public in particular, because I don't believe it's very clear what our opponents feel, Mr. Speaker. We've been belaboured for 2 hours with their response and their position. But I'd like to talk a little bit about the wider context that we are existing and the world that we've had to all experience, and what the impacts have been over the past year, and nearly a year when the World Health Organization, Mr. Speaker, declared we had an emergency. That was March 11th, 2020. And that emergency was related to the COVID pandemic. And the COVID-19 pandemic, Mr. Speaker, triggered the deepest global recession since the Great Depression in the 1930s. Global GDP, according to IMF projections, contracted somewhere in the area of 4.4%. It was forecasted that it had been the broadest collapse of per capita income since 1870, Mr. Speaker. I don't know if that's appreciated, according to World Bank and global statistics. It is expected by the end of even this year that real GDP per capita, particularly in the sub-Saharan Africa, will likely regress to the same level it was in 2007. Those are the projections. But let me just articulate more on the world that we have had to deal with and what is happening as a result of the pandemic. Poverty, extreme poverty, is now on the rise, as this had been going in the positive direction since 1998. Tens of millions of people falling back into poverty due to the pandemic. And these are the global picture I'm painting, Mr. Speaker. And it's expected that from the nearly 100 plus million people that may go back into poverty, that will also increase by nearly 50 million by the end of 2021. And the largest increase of that is expected in Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. So this is the type of impacts that have happened over the last year that now is impacting the world around us, Mr. Speaker. Unemployment is increasing drastically globally. And certainly we are challenged with that here in Bermuda. And the continued contractions will particularly hurt people who work in other countries in the informal sector, Mr. Speaker. Nearly 80% of the estimated 2 billion workers, Mr. Speaker, in the informal economy, have been significantly impacted with like reduced opportunities to work, less work hours. And particularly women, Mr. Speaker, who make up a significant amount of the global workforce. As part of that informal economy, supporting their families, are perhaps the most are the group that's going to have the most severe impact as a result of what happened through 2020 and this pandemic. That's some of the global picture, Mr. Speaker, that is faced around us. And we know this story here, but we also see that in other countries, even in the so-called industrialized and developed world, where many of our frontline workers in the healthcare sector and in the retail sector and all those sectors that were out there as the rest of us were in lockdown, but we're still providing services to the communities that they're a part of. Nurses, doctors, other healthcare professionals, people in grocery stores and providing other public services. Many of them were women and are women and have had to face the brunt of the pandemic and have been unfortunately the casualties of it as well. So the world through 2020 and even into this year is challenged. And even as that was a world that even pre-COVID was experiencing issues with economic growth, very sluggish. And many countries already challenged are now facing additional challenges, Mr. Speaker. International financial institutions have been required to lend and committing tens of billions of dollars to support many low and middle income countries because of the COVID response. And what we've seen certainly here in Bermuda and other places, Mr. Speaker, a need for governments to essentially take some of the taxpayer resources that they accumulate through the collection of taxes and fees and other avenues. They literally have had to put that back into the economy as they took it out to obviously fund certain other wider services. It had to be put back into the economy or even committed to supporting health care to protect the citizens from the ravages of COVID, but also to support other social services because people were out of work because of the economic shutdowns, which globally had to be faced. And certainly here ourselves with the tourism economy, an essential employee of many of our own residents, Mr. Speaker. I've seen one statistic that suggests that much of the job growth that was experienced in like recent years, a high percentage of that was hospitality workers. That obviously has been literally wiped out. And it's unfortunate that those persons who were taking advantage of great opportunities here now may be struggling to have employment. But that is everywhere because most of the economies globally, Mr. Speaker, that were dependent on providing services and like attracting services or involved in hospitality and tourism have all experienced the same ravages. And approximately 9% of the financing that has been supplied, nearly 100 billion or so in financing globally in US dollar terms, 9% has gone to low-income countries. So many of the poorest countries have needed the greatest amount of support because they will continue unless they can get to vaccines, which certainly themselves, in many cases, have a price, to properly support and protect their citizens, they're going to potentially have to deal with the ravages of COVID longer than some of the countries, not, just like Bermuda, who have been able to access these resources much sooner. And we must give credit to our own government for its efforts in mitigating the impacts of COVID on our citizenry, because we all heard in the very early days, Mr. Speaker, the model projections. It had hundreds of people here dying if we did nothing. But the government stood up, prepared, and executed an effort to protect our citizens. Having painted some of the global picture, Mr. Speaker, around us, that continues to be what we face, because until the globe gets a handle on the health crisis, the economic one will be more sluggish in its recovery, even as we see some optimism on the horizon. But that optimism should not be taken for granted. Vigilance is still crucial for all of us with this global situation. But let me just talk about Bermuda a little bit now, Mr. Speaker, with the time that I have left. After March of last year, the government had to act. And I can remember, certainly as a member of the government, and sitting around the table with our colleagues, whether they be in cabinet or not, and watching what was happening around the globe, we all knew that action had to be taken. We certainly did not know what would be the gravity of the situation that we would face. We did not know that we would be months and months and months and months fighting this pandemic. I perhaps thought that we all thought that perhaps a few months, 3 or 4 months would be enough and we would be out of it and we would move on back to what we would normally do, but that is not what happened. But the government had to act, and as has been eloquently reported in the budget statement presented by the Minister of Finance last week, Mr. Speaker, we acted. Because what did Bermuda face, Mr. Speaker? 10 months ago, as it stated in the first page of the introduction, our island was, Mr. Speaker, for the first time in modern history, shut down. I don't believe historically there has been any time similar to that in the history. World War I, World War II, any previous conflicts that has faced the place that is the settlement known as Bermuda never saw the country literally have to shut everything down. Quarantines, no shops, no restaurants, everybody staying at home, no sports, quarantines. We all had to go to the grocery shop via our names or numbers, names and limited numbers. That's what we faced. Many people had to transition from working in offices to working in their homes. And that in itself became a monumental transition and task of companies and businesses that could convert into essentially virtual employment. Still aspects of the economy running, but other aspects just totally shut down. And once that decision was made, Mr. Speaker, within a very short period of time, the government had to do certain things. And I can remember that even the discussions with the business community at the time, Mr. Speaker. And it may be argued that new relationships have been formed as a result of the experience of the last year. I can certainly say myself as a minister, I have, as a result of the requirements that were put on myself by the Premier and my colleagues during the pandemic, I had to engage with the business community in ways that I had never done before. But that fostered a certain level of understanding, trust, and transparency in our engagement that helped the islands. And we all were willing to take those chances. But at the same time, Mr. Speaker, I can tell you this. They looked to the government for the leadership that was required. When they spoke to the government at the time, they were looking for us to provide the clarity in the direction for the country to take. This Progressive Labour Party government, led by the Honorable David Burt, supported by now 30 other plus another 5 and capable members in both houses of the legislature. They came to us to ensure that the country could get through it. We didn't know what we would face, but that was a requirement. So one of the things, what was done? Within days, a program to keep people fed and surviving with benefit for those businesses, because when it was clear that the country had to be shut down, what did the government do? And I state this because I'm not so sure that if others were in this position, Mr. Speaker, they would have done what we had to do. Particularly when you hear sort of suggestions that the spending is implied to have been irresponsible, or the borrowing has been irresponsible. Well, what do you think that money was for? It was to keep people alive. It didn't go into anybody's pocket. It meant to keep people from starving. It meant to keep people surviving, to pay their bills, to exist until such time as the conditions could change. And there are people still benefiting from those choices. So yes, there are certain aspects of the priorities of government that had to be shifted, but they were shifted to benefit and keep the country alive. 2,000 people, Mr. Speaker, received $1.8 million worth of benefit in the first week after it was established. Ultimately, 56 million went to over 10,000 workers. Those are workers who literally were forced to not work. So the $127 million that was put aside by the government through engaging with the financial markets and its own resources was to do that, not to put the country in irresponsible fiscal position. The country had to be into lockdown. So this is what had to be done. And all indications are, Mr. Speaker, is that many people were satisfied with the response. There is a very appropriate quote by the finance minister in this statement as to, and it can be associated with Voltaire, the like perfect must not be the enemy of the good. Because perfection wasn't necessarily the objective, it was to be effective, to be swift, and to bring about a result of saving lives. So those are some of the things that had to be done. That has resulted in the position of where we are now. And we should be satisfied and proud that the finance minister, with the support of the government and all the members of the Progressive Party government behind him, has, yes, in a challenging circumstance, not ideal, has shaped a budget that has sought to position us to, in a disciplined way, manage the way forward so that once we get beyond this period, Mr. Speaker, we will be better positioned to develop opportunity to take advantage of the world around us that we hope will be relieved of the challenge of COVID, where people will be traveling here, where international business and commerce will be much more easily flowing, where airlines will continue and increase their lift to Bermuda, and cruise ships will return as well to take advantage of the offerings of our beautiful island. That will all return at some point. But in the meantime, we have to, as a government, shape the community in a way that will ensure that the future has more opportunity than in the past. And we can look to the past for reference, but not try and duplicate it. Because we need to build a different Bermuda going forward. That, and frankly, in like my humble view, Mr. Speaker, erases some of the errors of the past. And some of that is encapsulated, and the direction is encapsulated with the references to the economic recovery plan that was spoken about and referenced by the Honorable Finance Minister as a way forward, but also by the Premier earlier today. But, Mr. Speaker, it's very important that everybody in Bermuda realize that this is one of those times where we all have to get into the boat and understand that we've got to row it together. We have to each take an oar and be in sync, irrespective of your position in society. And that's where the whole thing about equity and eliminating inequality is very important in Bermuda. Because unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, as we have seen in recent years, and certainly so has the pandemic revealed this, and that the inequalities that have stifled the proper development of our people in this country still pervades us. And those inequities and those inequalities in opportunity, in access, and even capital still pervade the experience of many Bermudians. And there are some people who still believe that people can come to Bermuda and take advantage of opportunities much more quickly and much more efficiently than those who are here and have Bermuda only as the only home that they have. So how do we address that? We have to develop a new direction economically, Mr. Speaker. And that direction is not only a part of the economic recovery plan that has been referenced in the statement from the finance minister, but also in so many of the other initiatives that the government has endeavored to enter into. Yes, education reform will take time, but it is about achieving that goal. It's creating a system that is nimble, that is responsive to the world around us, and prepares our young people to embrace not only the Bermuda opportunity, but the globe of opportunity. That's what we have to develop there. We have to look about diversifying our economy. Yes, tourism and aspects of international business have served us well in our development over the past 50, 60 years. But the world is different now. And some of the reasons and rationales of those particular industries and their presence in Bermuda have to be changed. And we have to develop ourselves into a different brand, particularly around the hospitality sector. But we also have to attract new business in the international sector. So like diversification of international business here will be important. Embracing technology even more will be important. And making that a mainstay of our education and our development and our skill sets as a country will be important. Showing Bermuda to be not just an orthodox member of the sort of, Western democratic business sort of group that is between London and New York and Ottawa or Toronto and Brussels, but actually showing that we're open to the world, that we are attracting innovations in energy. We're attracting innovation in technology. We are attracting people with interesting skills and also unique skills who can come here and work with our own resident population and help them to develop skills that can be global in their opportunity. That's the sort of realm that we have to develop here. And even as we talk about immigration reform, Mr. Speaker, I often get very tired of hearing that there's this emphasis on just bringing more bodies onto the island, because that's not enough. That's a very simplistic view of immigration. And yes, we have a 1956 Act, which there seems to be at least a consensus with our opponents on this one that it has to be changed. What we actually do and how we change it, perhaps there is some dispute. But as I recall, the opposition sat around the same table in support of developing comprehensive immigration reform with the government. So certainly, on many of the items that are the chief prescriptions for immigration change should be embraced openly, and we should be able to hold hands on. But as we continuously hear, there seems to be that the opposition doesn't want to kind of walk and step with the same proposals that they spent the last 3 years around the table with us working on. But hey, I understand maybe it's just politics, but comprehensive immigration reform has actually been the chief commitment around that issue of the country.
Deputy, you have just under 2 minutes left, Deputy.
Gracious me, Mr. Speaker, time just flies.
Yes.
But with that, I think I can say, as I said from the very beginning, we are faced with a very historic, monumental opportunity in our history to reshape this economy, to reshape Bermuda, to embrace the opportunity to be a leader in climate, to be a leader in technology, to be a leader in innovation, to be a leader in addressing inequality, to like diversifying our economy, and to making solid steps that are going to reshape Bermuda in a way that 10, 20 years from now, the decisions that were made, there'll be a consensus that they were the right ones, irrespective of where you sit in the political divide. So I look forward to working with every Bermudian on that journey, Mr. Speaker, because it's important. It is about the survival of our community as we face the pandemic, but it's also shaping a bright and optimistic future that we all can be a part of, irrespective of where you sit from income or where you live or what you see are your dreams for the future. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Deputy Premier. Does any other member wish to make a contribution at this time?
Good afternoon, Mr. Speaker.
Good afternoon. Someone like MP Dunkley? MP Dunkley, you have your 30 minutes.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I get into my presentation today, let me start off where the Deputy Premier ended, where he said we have a monumental opportunity to reshape our economy. He is correct. He's 100% correct. But we have no choice, Mr. Speaker, and we must not waste that opportunity or squander that opportunity in anything we do. We have no choice, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, opposition leader, early this afternoon, as we came back from lunch, I thought delivered a very comprehensive and a very balanced reply to the budget. He offered a detailed analysis all the way through his presentation. He offered critique where it was necessary, and he provided many suggestions that will help the government carry on in their journey to bring Bermuda back to a better position. And the member who just spoke before me said, Mr. Speaker, that he found the two statements contrasting. Well, yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker, because the opposition leader's statement was detailed, it was thorough, and it was plain talk that everyone could understand, and it covered all the important items. It was an address that gave us a good direction of where we needed to go and how we could get there. Mr. Speaker, the government's budget that was delivered last week, I believe, lacked focus on some of the key areas facing Bermuda. International business, tourism. These are our biggest job creators They are proven industries that can be successful. There was very little mention of gaming, as the opposition leader talked about. The budget sadly lacked on a direction on where we're going to go with much needed healthcare reform. In addition, Mr. Speaker, I believe it provided very little hope for those Bermudians who are without a job at the present time. Now, Mr. Speaker, economies all throughout the world are propped up by borrowing. Larger countries, that is an easier task to work through. Smaller countries like Bermuda, we have to be very careful on where we go as far as the borrowing takes place. We've said all along, and I recall saying during the budget debate last year, when there was talk about the coronavirus, which hadn't impacted us to a full extent yet, but it became very clear as we went through the number of days of the committees of supply that the COVID-19 pandemic was going to hit us very strongly. I recall talking about the need to borrow responsibly to help our people. And we're in that position right now. Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to see that the finance minister, in regards to government fiscal policy, has been restrained in the appropriate way, that there have been no new taxes. And for me, knowing the finance minister and watching him perform his job over the past couple of years, it was expected based on the very fragile state of our economic condition at this time. Every area except of international business has struggled greatly over the last year. It wouldn't have been responsible to raise taxes. It wouldn't have been responsible to spend freely other than spending to help us get rid of COVID-19 and deal with those challenges. As we move forward, government must continue to operate its sales in a very tight fashion while we help those who are struggling in our community. We must continue to support those people who struggle in our community because, as members have said, we are nowhere near out of the woods. And Mr. Speaker, that brings me to the economic recovery plan, which government has laid out, and the Premier took an opportunity to speak to it today in a ministerial statement. If you would allow me to refer to the budget book where it talks about that, I think this economic recovery plan is weak. Simply weak, Mr. Speaker. While the guiding principles are good, and those are listed on page 12 and page 13, COVID-19 is a priority is the first one. Reduce the cost of living is the second. There must be fairness and equity is the third. Financial viability is the fourth. Fiscal prudence the fifth. And sixth, timeliness. While those guiding principles are sound, if you look at the plan itself, Mr. Speaker, it's very difficult to gain a great deal of hope from the plan. The 7 sections that are listed in the budget book, Mr. Speaker, first, economic diversification. Well, obviously, diversification always makes sense when there's an opportunity to deal with it. And so that while it's part of a plan, we need to see more meat on the bone of what that economic diversification really means, because fintech hasn't proven to provide the jobs for that many Bermudians at the present time. And economic diversification, quite often, Mr. Speaker, takes some time to build, to ferment, to actually grow. What we need now, Mr. Speaker, is we need action to put those unemployed people back to work. The second priority initiative is the financial markets. The government said they'll focus on affordable access to capital for businesses and consumers. Well, Mr. Speaker, because of what's taking place in the world, rates are probably the lowest they have been since in anyone's memory. So we have a perfect example right here to deal with getting capital at good rates and putting it to work, Mr. Speaker. But there must be a plan to make that work. Infrastructure investment, Mr. Speaker, we support that 100%. But what is listed in the budget book certainly doesn't put enough meats on the bones, because the construction of a shoreside fishing facility, Mr. Speaker, while it sounds good, what do the dozens of local fishermen think about this, and have they been consulted in this? And what is that shoreside fishing facility actually going to do? What jobs is it going to create? It reminds me, Mr. Speaker, of the vertical farming that Minister Ferbert has talked about, and it seems to have slipped past the radar. Number 4 is expanding the resident population. Mr. Speaker, the Honorable Minister of Immigration at the current time, Minister Haywood, and former minister from another place, Faye, in their immigration policy, Mr. Speaker, you could almost call them twins. Because the policy that we've seen from the PLP, although it's been very slow in being implemented, seems like a carbon copy of what the OBA was trying to put forward, Mr. Speaker. But one glaring change is that Minister Haywood says, well, I hold the keys to the door. Mr. Speaker, we need to get rid of that red tape, and we need to get rid of somebody holding the keys to the door to use as they decide to use. We talked about immigration long enough. We talked about boosting our resident population to contribute to our community. We talked about the jobs that they can help bring for Bermudians long enough. Now we need to see the rubber meet the road. 5, 6, and 7, Mr. Speaker, are also weak in my view. Mr. Speaker, and then the paragraph about the government knows a good plan poorly executed can be worse than no plan at all, and they're dedicated to create a project management team. This jumped right off the pages at me, Mr. Speaker, because while all the wording is good, and it sounds like a noble idea, Mr. Speaker, I think anyone will have a concern until they know how it's going to be set up, who's going to run it, and what their actual guiding principles are going to be, Mr. Speaker. We need to cut the red tape. We need to make sure that there's no bureaucracy, because those people who have been struggling for the last year cannot afford to struggle for much longer. Now, Mr. Speaker, as I've given an overview of the weak economic plan by the government, let me just focus for a moment on the economy. We know if we turn to page 22 and 23 in the budget book, you'll see that on page 23, 2,924 jobs were lost last year, a reduction of 8.5%. Those jobs take into consideration the 989 jobs that were lost because of layoffs. We know from the opposition leader's reply that GDP is estimated to shrink between 7 and 9%. We know that the IB sector held up very well during the sharp global economic downturn. We know that their employees managed to work from home here in Bermuda and all throughout the world, Mr. Speaker, and no one would dare argue that Bermuda is not the best place to work from home from. Mr. Speaker, we know that in 2020, insurance startups have bolstered our employment slightly because of pandemic-related capital that has sprung into the market. These are opportunities that we need to take advantage of, Mr. Speaker, and I want to take this opportunity to say thank you to international business. It's not often that we thank our people, or not often enough we thank the people who help us in many ways, but we should thank international business because, Mr. Speaker, the pandemic proved they can be anywhere in the world. And now is an opportunity for us to bring more of them back to our island. Mr. Speaker, from the job numbers, you can see that tourism and hospitality crashed. The numbers are actually quite scary, and I'll get to those in a minute. As the opposition leader said, retail has rebounded due in large part because people couldn't travel or could only travel minimally, and they were shopping at home. New building permits applications declined 14% in 2020. Planning applications also declined 11% in 2020. And the value of new projects in the first 2 quarters, as the opposition leader said, plummeted by 45%. None of this is good news considering the fact that the airport's open and that construction is finished, and that St. Regis is due to open in a few short months. Now, Mr. Speaker, Bermuda is no different than almost every other country in the world, except China, Mr. Speaker. The epicenter of the start of COVID, China is predicted to be the only major economy to post positive growth in 2020, Mr. Speaker. All other countries were shaken greatly. Small countries like Bermuda were shaken more. So the Bermuda economy, Mr. Speaker, it's on life support in 2020. And government acted prudently to triage us through that life support. But let's look at those job numbers, Mr. Speaker, because I think those job numbers highlight exactly some of the challenges we face and where we turned in a short period of time. I've already said that 24 jobs were lost in the last year. International business remained flat. Surprisingly, Mr. Speaker, public administration was up 82 jobs. There were a couple other categories that saw a slight increase, such as electrical, water supply and waste management, professional, scientific, and technical activities, and administration and social services was relatively flat. But if you look at the rest of the market, Mr. Speaker, it tells you a very different story. Manufacturing was down 78 jobs, or 20%. Agriculture and fishing was down 9 jobs, or 5%. Construction and quarrying was down 82 jobs, or 4%. Wholesale and retail down 264 jobs, or 7%. Transportation and storage down 104 jobs, or 7%. Hospitality, which consists of accommodation and food service activities, down a whopping 1,784 jobs, or 38%, Mr. Speaker. Information and communications down 11%, 77 jobs. Finance and insurance activities down 69 jobs, or 4%. Real estate was also down, as was health and social work care down 17%. Mr. Speaker, these are indeed startling numbers, and we should not forget that while a number of jobs were lost in our economy, on the back of the PLP government saying 441 jobs were created in the prior year, and there was some contention about that number, we must not forget, Mr. Speaker, that there are many people who were forced to work reduced hours through the year. So the struggle, Mr. Speaker, is very real, but this budget does very little to address it. Those 2,924 people that are unemployed in this last year alone, what are they going to do for the next year? Because while we're more optimistic about where we're going to go and how we're going to get there, COVID has shown that it's very unpredictable and it always rears its ugly head, at least when we want it to, Mr. Speaker. How are those 2,924 people going to get a job, to pay bills, to buy groceries, to live some sort of comforting life, Mr. Speaker? Job losses will certainly continue throughout this year as people continue to struggle and businesses continue to struggle. So the benefits that government rightly gave in the past year need to be considered as we move forward, because the uptick in employment growth is certainly not going to be there, Mr. Speaker. Certainly not in the first half of this year. And Mr. Speaker, just before I get off this job table, an interesting analysis of it is if you look at the top 5 employment categories on the island. The number 5 employment category this year and last year as well has been human health and social work, with 2,405 jobs, which is down considerably from the year before of 484 jobs. Mr. Speaker, the number 4 job category in 2020 was hospitality. It slipped from number 1, Mr. Speaker. With the fall of 1,784 jobs, hospitality went from the major employer to Bermuda to the 4th highest employment category. Mr. Speaker, the number 3 employment category was wholesale and resale trade, which slipped from number 2 the year before, Mr. Speaker. The second highest employment category was international business, which grew from number 3, Mr. Speaker. That's good news in a bad scenario. The largest employment occupation in Bermuda, Mr. Speaker, rising from 4th to number 1, is public administration. Biggest employer in Bermuda is public administration, Mr. Speaker. And this must send us a clear message, as the opposition leader has talked about in his brief today. While it's probably needed in the short term for some of these people to jump in and help with COVID, public administration, as the largest employer in Bermuda, does not bode well for a healthy economy, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the biggest issue that we had in the last year was obviously COVID-19, and the opposition leader addressed it, as did the member who spoke before me. Interestingly enough, in this debate last year, we knew COVID-19 was coming because many people talked about it. In fact, on the day of the economic debate, the Minister of Health, Minister Wilson, gave a statement on COVID-19. I congratulate the government for being on the ball in relation to preparing us for COVID-19. It's been a long year. COVID has dominated. The opposition, Mr. Speaker, has been generally very supportive of all the measures. Yes, we've been critical along the way about some of the challenges we had with rest homes, some of the challenges we had with the claim by the government that the testing was aggressive when in fact it wasn't in the beginning, Mr. Speaker. It was been our job as the opposition to be critical when it was appropriate, but during the pandemic, we've been very cautious to make sure that we have supported the government because people need to rally together. We need to all grip those oars in the boat because we knew, Mr. Speaker, that there were no easy decisions to make. There were no easy decisions about closing down the airport. There were no easy decisions about a lockdown or a shelter in place. There have been no easy decisions, Mr. Speaker, but thanks to all of us working together, thanks to the support of people wanting to be involved in giving advice, we've made it through. And thanks, Mr. Speaker, to the UK for helping us put us in this position. We're right now here today, on March 5th, 2021. We're probably in a better position than every other small economy around the world in dealing with COVID-19. And why do I say that, Mr. Speaker? I say that for the simple fact is that we managed to get up and running with testing. And the UK provided us with thousands of test kits and whatever else is required to make it happen, where we've been very aggressive with testing. And in November, when we had a peak that got out of control in December, we could test and we could contact trace and we could follow up where people were. The UK has also been very helpful to us as we geared up for the vaccines. You know, the free vaccines that have gone on our shores, and people now are starting to overcome some of the hesitancy, I hope, that allows us to be in a better position to deal with it. But it's been a long year. It's been a tiring year, and the pandemic continues to move on. People are tired of the restrictions. Many people are out of work, but we must shoulder on, Mr. Speaker, and that means we must follow regulations and restrictions. And I specifically put this in my comments today, Mr. Speaker, because there are few amongst us who will break those well-intentioned rules. The very few have spoiled the difficult path of a better tomorrow that we tried to take through COVID. First, we had the incident at Blue. Then we had the uptick through November and December. And now we've had an uptick because of some private parties over the past few days, Mr. Speaker. This is totally unacceptable. These type of actions are totally unacceptable, and people are frustrated. People have called me, contacted me, and expressed their frustrations about it. We have laws in place, we have restrictions, and those people must be held accountable for their actions. They must appear in court because they've endangered our community and they've set back progress. This has made it all the more difficult, Mr. Speaker, for us to get through the pandemic, and we do not need it to happen again. This curfew implementation just 2 nights ago, after only being lifted a short period of time ago, is as a result of pure negligence or wanton disregard by a few, which goes against the grain of the many, Mr. Speaker. And as this pandemic is not going to disappear quickly, we need to make sure all of us are accountable for the actions we have. So, Mr. Speaker, as we go through the pandemic, and the future does look a bit brighter than it looked at this time last year, certainly. No one knows how in the coming months it will play out with COVID. We have our theories. We have science to help us out. But what we do know is we know that certain measures work. As the opposition leader put in his brief, masking, distancing, and sanitizing. Mr. Speaker, we do know that vaccines work. The evidence is there. And I urge all people to sign up and to get a vaccine, because only together will we get out of this through some type of herd immunity. Mr. Speaker, our way forward is simple, but it is hard at the same time. It's simple because we know what we have to do. It's hard because it's taken a long time and our life is restricted because of it. And I want to take this opportunity at this time, Mr. Speaker, to thank all of those who have been on the front line over the past year and helping to deal with COVID. Our first reflection goes to all the healthcare workers who've been doing it for a year. But there are many people who behind the scenes that we don't see, so we might not know. There's service personnel. There's all those people who have worked hard in our grocery stores, for example, during the shelter-in-place period. All of those people have done a tremendous job under tremendous strain. In the beginning, I'm sure a lot of it was managed because of the adrenaline rush that they got because we knew we had a real challenge. So every day you woke up, you went to work, you did the best you can, you took your safety for concern because the fear of the unknown was great and you had that adrenaline rush in a bad way. But now, Mr. Speaker, the daily grind is kicked in where we're doing the same thing over and over and over again, and those workers have to be getting fatigued. And so we say thank you to them for everything they've done to help us get to this point. But we're not out of the woods yet. And Mr. Speaker, it's clear to all of us the quickest way out is by staying the course of what we know that works. What we know that works with COVID, Mr. Speaker, because if we do not, our collective pain will stay there, will continue longer than necessary. We won't know the impact of COVID for decades, Mr. Speaker. The impact on our community, the impact on us as people, the impact on us, our mental health, and certainly the economic impact, Mr. Speaker. But what we do know is that we can work through this together because there are many Bermudians who are struggling. Now, Mr. Speaker, the PLP has talked repeatedly in the past about two Bermudas. Well, Mr. Speaker, it's very clear to me that the two Bermudas the PLP alluded to now are more of a reality than ever before. And I'm not saying that to be derogatory or to be overly critical. But what COVID-19 has done is it's created a real divide in Bermuda between those who have money they can fall back on and live, and those who have nothing to live from and are at the mercy of others to help them, Mr. Speaker. And so while there has been talk about two Bermudas, we need to make sure that we foster an environment where we lift people back up on their feet. I referred to international business earlier in my conversation, Mr. Speaker. We need to make sure that with international business, not only do we talk about diversification, but we need to go to them and make sure that they understand that there's opportunity to grow in Bermuda. We need to ask them what those opportunities are for them. How do we get more people on the island to do the jobs? Bring more expertise onto the island. Stop sending jobs off the island. Bring them back here. And create more jobs in the island, more jobs for Bermudians, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we need to make sure that not only is government see fit to attract people who can invest $2.5 million, but there's more in the game than just that. It's no good just to attract somebody with a lot of money if they're not going to contribute to our economy with creation of opportunities for Bermuda. Opportunities for Bermudians to get jobs, Mr. Speaker. One of the greatest disappointments of this budget, Mr. Speaker, is the lack of talk about tourism. We've seen tourism jobs, the biggest downfall in 1 year, of 1,784 jobs lost in 1 year, Mr. Speaker. Those jobs won't come back if we wait for them to come back. We have a perfect opportunity to grow tourism because we're in a better position than most other small countries, and we should plan for that growth, not just talk about it. Most of those people who work in hospitality can get back to work in hospitality quicker than they can be retrained to get in any new industry. And that's what we need to do, Mr. Speaker. This budget is short on prospects of opportunity for jobs of those people out of work. And I'm most surprised that the PLP is not addressing that, because that's the base that they say they like to talk to, Mr. Speaker. So rather than seeing growth in public administration, we need to see growth in the private sector, where people have an opportunity to get involved, and that growth helps all of us in our community. And Mr. Speaker, the last thing I would like to speak to, I believe I've just got about 2 minutes left in my time, Mr. Speaker, is
Correct.
the real shortage of any information about where we're going in healthcare in the budget. And I'm sure when we get to the debate, on the Committee of Supply, there'll be more discussion about it. But, Mr. Speaker, before COVID-19, the changes that were mooted by the government in regards to healthcare were the talk of the island. Now, obviously, COVID-19's changed the focus, and a lot of that conversation has gone away. But there are small lines in there about the changes that are coming, Mr. Speaker. We live in a country where our healthcare is very expensive. It is simply unsustainable for all of us, Mr. Speaker. If we don't get these changes right, if we don't make these changes work for all of us, it will be a disaster, and we'll see more people leaving the country. That's the simple reality of it all, Mr. Speaker. So while government says they have consulted, they need to do a better job, because I'm not sure of what the government definition of consultation means, Mr. Speaker, as we've seen Bill in another place, and some concerns about that. We need to get all people involved in the consultation so we get the changes in healthcare right, because COVID has proven many people can work anywhere in the world they want. They can work on their phone anywhere in the world as long as they've got a phone and internet service. We do not want to see people leaving this country because we get healthcare changes wrong. We cannot afford it. People cannot afford to pay the premium, so we need to have real, sincere consultation moving forward. Mr. Speaker, with that, I'd like to thank you for your time, and once again, I'd like to commend the opposition leader for a very well thought out, detailed presentation. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Honourable Member. Does any other Honourable Member wish to make a contribution at this time? Any other member?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Yes.
You see me?
Minister Furman?
How are you?
Yes. You have your 30 minutes, sir.
Good. Mr. Speaker, first I want to say good afternoon to you, Mr. Speaker, and good afternoon to...
Good afternoon.
Let me get my glass so I can see. Mr. Speaker, it's interesting. I've been listening to the opposition, and it's important that I point out a few things that came to my attention. First of all, the opposition leader spoke about reducing the amount of MPs, and I want so people will be quite aware of this. There was a Progressive Party government that way back, I think it was early 2000, 1997, 98, talking about allowing 30 MPs in Bermuda. It was the United Bermuda Party at the time that did not want 30 MPs. The reason why was very clear, Mr. Speaker. They felt that they would lose most of the seats and would go to the Progressive Party. So once you start dividing up the country in 30s, in 30 even numbers, then the power base that the United Bermuda Party relied on will kind of disappear. Mr. Speaker, also the creation of Speaker, I have to leave a minute. I just feel faint right now. Do you hear me, Mr. Speaker?
Minister?
Yeah, just allow me 2 minutes. I just feel kind of fainted. I'll pass over to my colleague, next person.
Would you like to, members, we're going to ask if you don't mind yielding and letting another member take the floor, and the minister, when your health restores later after that member speaks, you can come back. Does any other member like to speak at this time?
Mr. Speaker?
Yes.
Minister Rabin?
Yes, Minister. You can do 30 minutes, and then the Minister further, when he's feeling better, can return. Okay?
Yeah, I'm feeling a little under the weather as well, but
no, you don't have to take the whole 30 minutes. You're not obligated to take it all. I
do wish for his speedy recovery. But I would say that I probably wasn't surprised that the presentation that we have today, it's indicative of the types of presentations that we've had from the One Bermuda Alliance ever since they've become the opposition. To say that we just listened to an hour and 45 minutes of what I would consider just gotcha moments, littered through, some occasional good suggestions is probably the summary of what I would say of this budget reply. And I'm thinking, the budget when it started, it talked about our budget reply from our minister of not having any real concrete plans. And then we just listened to the former Premier Dunphy speak essentially the same thing. And I'm left wondering where exactly were the suggestions coming from the One Bermuda Alliance. We find ourselves now in a situation we could have never imagined that we would ever be in, coming off a year where the entire world has seen an economic downturn and basically shuddering because of the COVID-19 issues that we've seen. And, you have people say that this is a economic downturn not seen since the last Great Depression. And so it's going to take all of us working together to pull us out of where we are. And I believe, and I commend the finance minister for the budget that he's put together, and for this time, and it's a budget for the time that we find ourselves in. And it is gonna work, but it can work unless we have all hands on deck, rowing in the same direction. As I said, I just want to commend our Minister of Finance, Minister Dickinson, for putting out a document. I mean, it clearly states where we are, how we got to where we are, and what we need to get to a better place. And so when I listen to the opposition leader speak, and he talks about it is devoid of ideas and it doesn't take into account the doldrums we were in, I would have to remind that member that prior to COVID, we were headed for budget surpluses. It was clearly articulated in the glide path that had been put forth several years ago that's where we were headed. And so to talk about this as if the economy was in a tailspin prior to COVID, and COVID has just made it even worse. It's rubbish. It is absolute rubbish for anyone who's actually paying attention. Now, there's no doubt that the COVID crisis had a tremendous effect on our finances, but there are things that had to be done to ensure that our people survive as I just stated, was a global calamity, and things were done, and money was borrowed, and the debt ceiling was increased, and all of the things were done, and we should not be upset about that, because these are the things that had to be done. These are things worldwide that had to be done. And so to try and poo-poo that and try to make light of that is truly disingenuous, and it truly does show us the I'm trying to be parliamentary here, but the head in the sand, airy-fairy things that consistently come from the other side, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this was a difficult budget to put together. I was there. I was in the room. We fought each other. We argued. We challenged our ministries to do better, to look at where we are, find those necessary reductions so we can have a budget that does something that hasn't been done in a long time, and that is not increase taxes to the everyday Mr. and Mrs. Bermuda. We've done that. We've accomplished that. The deficit from last year has been cut in half this year. We've done that. And so, instead of finding ways to poke holes with gotcha moments, as I said, I would like to see the opposition actually come and either provide some useful commentary, some suggestions on how we can do things differently, some credible suggestions, instead of these continuously trying to catch us out and catch and so Bermuda, look what they've done. Look, what they've done. Instead of saying, hey, we understand what you're doing. Let's see how we can move it forward, Mr. Speaker. And so, Mr. Speaker, when I look at the statement given by the opposition leader, and and start going through it. I'm sure other members will follow me and they'll find other particular points because everyone finds their things that they kind of latch onto when we have these things. But the one thing, Mr. Speaker, that really stood out initially when I was listening and reading this was when the opposition leader talked about base rates, and he was opining about government better talk to the banking association if you're going to talk about adjusting rates, and gave a pseudo threat of what could happen if we figured out a way to give lower borrowing rates for our hard working Bermudians, so those ones that out there thinking, there's no future for me in Bermuda because it's just too expensive. I would like to buy a house, but I can't afford it. I would like to buy a car, but I can't afford it, Mr. Speaker. And so now I was interested to hear the opposition leader, Mr. Speaker, go on about that and threaten that the banks will leave here, Mr. Speaker. But Mr. Speaker, what I did not hear from the opposition leader was his declaration of interest. He works for one of these major banks that he talks about. So is he speaking because he wants to protect his life?
Minister, just to correct you, he did declare his interest when he made reference to the banks.
And thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I do apologize for that because I did not hear that when he did. But Mr. Speaker, when he does speak of that, is he speaking about protecting his livelihood, or is he speaking about what is truly good for the voter, the electorate of Bermuda? That's the question that we have to answer. And I know that there's a fine balance we have to walk because you'll often hear people say if you're not conflicted, then you're not involved here in Bermuda because of the fact that it is that small of an island, and everybody, there's there's 1 degree of separation between just about everything that we do around here. But Mr. Speaker, that did stand up to me, and I think in the coming weeks that member will probably have to clarify. Is he looking out for himself, or is he looking out for the electorate when he talks about that? And Mr. Speaker, the next thing that stood out to me was, and this was interesting. And it's when the member was talking about immigration, and I want to quote from the document on page 20. And he says when he's talking about immigration, he says it's been a political football with the aid of successive PLP governments. This issue has also stoked civil unrest. I find that an interesting statement that the member would state, because what he is implying is that immigration, whenever there's been civil unrest or whenever there's been a pushback, there has to be the PLP government stoking the fires behind the scenes for these people. But no, Mr. Speaker, this is exactly what we find wrong with the Bermuda Alliance: the refusal to admit and acknowledge that they screwed up. Just absolute refusal. There was not civil unrest because the PLP stoked. There was civil unrest because decisions made by the One Bermuda Alliance around immigration were horrible. They invoked emotions within people that they only brought about themselves. No one had to, Mr. Speaker, I was in the Senate. I sat in another place when the Senate was overrun because then, as they put the great Senator Michael Fay introduced legislation to allow PRCs to purchase any property they want in Bermuda. He removed the threshold so they could purchase any property in Bermuda. And why were people upset? Because the One Bermuda Alliance was blind to the fact that we were going through an economic crisis, and Bermudian families who had owned properties for generations within their family were finding themselves in financial trouble. When you take an opportunity to unleash the spending power of the PRC that was not allowed to purchase properties under a certain threshold, of course they're going to swoop down and purchase these properties from these hard-working Bermudian families. And yes, Bermudians are going to be upset. You don't need a political party to stoke those emotions, Mr. Speaker. They did it to themselves. As Bermudians were struggling to hold on to their properties, they unleashed a group of people in Bermuda that had tons of cash, because if you go back to then, you remember the real estate agents were excited when saying, yes, property prices are inching up, and what is the biggest surprise is most of these property purchases are by cash. How many people, and the former member that spoke earlier, Duncan, talked about the two Bermudas. How many two Bermudas, what side of Bermuda has walking around here with $1 million in cash, Mr. Speaker? It certainly isn't that hardworking Bermudian, black Bermudian that's been struggling because and trying to figure out how to navigate around these interest rates for mortgages, etc. So when they talk about civil unrest, own it. And simply just own it. Stop trying to deflect. Own that you screwed up and you did things to anger people. Understand that. We can go back to the immigration law, which a loophole was found. Legislation was introduced by the great late Walton Brown to close that loophole, and the One Bermuda Alliance refused to close it. How can you blame the Progressive Labor Party for that? You said no. We will allow that loophole to remain open. We will allow persons to sneak in for Bermudian status under the darkness of night because they found a loophole. You could have closed it, but you didn't. What about the suggestion to allow non-Bermudian children to compete against Bermudian children for summer jobs? You didn't need the PRP to stoke any emotions around that. You did it yourself. Own it. And see, we will not get to a place where we're able to move together hand in hand until we stop playing politics as normal. And that is, own when you make a mistake and admit you made a mistake, and so we can move on. Now, Mr. Speaker, I just wanted to highlight that because I thought it was interesting when we looked at the immigration policies and we were talking about immigration. I thought it was pretty good as well. When this morning when the Premier gave the ministerial statement about the economic recovery plan, and one of the questions, and I was asked repeatedly, well, can you name five of the pillars of the economic recovery plan out of the 30? And Mr. Speaker, and rightly so, I really do thank the Honorable Honorable Member Dunkley, who went back to the budget statement and turned to page 13 and 14, where 7 of those are named. and so I just wonder, well, what was going on? It's like name, and here we are, 7 of them. The opposition leader speaks about increasing the population in Bermuda as a way of economic recovery, and that is listed here as number 4 out of the 7 listed in our budget statement, expanding the resident population. And so we are working we can work together if you just want to. If you stop trying to figure out, let me see how I can catch these guys out. Let me see how I can point out where they said one thing and did something else. Stop it. That's not helping us. That's not helping our people, and it's not helping our country. All it looks as we're just here bickering back and forth, because we have nothing else better to do. We do have better things to do, and that is moving our country forward together, Mr. Speaker. Now, Mr. Speaker, the next thing that stood out to me was, and this is, Mr. Speaker, when you start talking about pure politics. Mr. Speaker, the opposition leader, and I quote from page 39, and he says, "It was noted the Ministry of Youth, Cultural Affairs, and Sports Headquarters had a 38% reduction in allocation. Is this department not valued?" I read that and I went, 38%. Let me actually go take a look. Mr. Speaker, 38% works out to be $822,000. $822,000. $800,000 of that is a reduction in professional services and a reduction in salaries, meaning there are posts that may have been funded and unfilled that will not be filled, and there's a reduction in consultants. The very things that we go back to the page where that minister was talking about the SAGE report and how we should be following the SAGE report and figuring out how to run our departments better and reduce the money we spend on and if you go back to the actual SAGE report on consultants and the number of employees within the department, we now have one that's here, but because it's just politicking, it's being mentioned in his budget reply as an issue. You can't have it both ways, opposition leader. You can't demand that we look at the SAGE report and we come up with ways to run government more efficiently, and then take a pot shot because we're doing it. Because it makes for good political theater. Stop it. That's not how we're going to move Bermuda forward. And, you know, we talk about the SAGE report, and I was interested to read that in this document. And as the speaker before me had started off by saying, you know, and we talk about reducing the number of MPs, reducing the number of departments, reducing the number of ministers. The SAGE report was done in 2013. 2013 went by, 2014 went by, 2015 went by, and most of 2017 went by, and the One Bermuda Alliance instituted very little of the SAGE report. Here we are now, 3.5 years later, after. So here we are, some just over 4 years, just under 4 years later, after the last election, and all of a sudden, it's why haven't you guys implemented the report that you commissioned? The report that you spent $1.2 million to commission. Stop with the political theater. It's not helping any of us. It really is not. And the two Bermudas out there, as Member Dunkley referred to, they see it too. They see exactly what it is you're saying. Now, Mr. Speaker, I do want to move on to my last part that I want to talk about, which is education. And I'm always interested, obviously as the education minister, to see what the One Bermuda Alliance is going to say. And of course, we started off, education part started off with reference to the Independent Education Authority, and they will note that you will never hear you will never hear this minister say Independent Education Authority. We say Education Authority, Mr. Speaker. And it goes on to say that the Education Authority cannot bring about, it's not the it's not the cure, and it talks about some other things that could happen, that should happen. Continuing Professional Development Center, Mr. Speaker. It talks about foundational counselors to support our children, Mr. Speaker. It also talks about that the government should support, protect the Bermuda College from the financial impact of crisis. And Mr. Speaker, when I read this stuff, Mr. Speaker, it truly does sink my heart, Mr. Speaker. And you know why, Mr. Speaker? It's because I have reached out to the Shadow Minister of Education, the current one. I reached out to the former Shadow Minister of Education, MP Jackson, when she was Shadow Minister for a bit. I've reached out to the current. I've asked them to come and sit with me so we can talk about education reform, so they can be informed, because I recognize that education requires all of us to be on the same page. Mr. Speaker, not one of them has taken me up on that opportunity.
Order.
Take your point of order, yes.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I just wanted to say that we have met with the minister, and he did give us a comprehensive overview of the reform, and we look forward to meeting with him again in the future.
Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, and I was going to get to that. The last meeting I had with the opposition, Mr. Speaker, was March 2020. I have contacted both of them since the last election, and neither of them have found time to meet with me. As a matter of fact, Mr. Speaker, I can read verbatim. I will check my calendar and get back to you when I'm able to meet. That is the response.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
I have not received any response.
You're taking point of order.
On subsequent occasions to say, can we meet?
Mr. Speaker, I and my colleagues have attended the online parish primary school reforms meetings and presentations, and we have remained engaged. We're listening.
Thank you.
As I stated, I have reached out directly to the Shadow Minister of Education. I have asked him to come and sit with me one-on-one so we can talk about education reform. The response has been, I will check my calendar and will let you know when I can meet. We have followed up on several occasions, and the response is always the same. And I will leave it at that. Okay? If you really want to know what's going on with education, you would come and meet with the minister. You would not sneak in to
You've been on the good ground all this time. Keep moving on. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, but when I read things, when I read things in here, when it talks about the public education reform and the consultation that's going on now about the parish primary school concept. Mr. Speaker, in March 2020, Mr. Speaker, I held a Zoom session with the One Bermuda Alliance. And guess what we talked about in that Zoom session? Parish primary schools. And that the consultation was going to start that summer. However, COVID and it didn't enable us to do what we wanted to do that summer, so it was pushed further down into the year, Mr. Speaker. So for the opposition leader to put in his document as if it's this aha, I got you moment, if this was so important, you would have mentioned it in your election platform, Mr. Speaker. This is the same government that held a throne speech and then signed the airport deal a week later without even mentioning an airport deal in their throne speech. So disingenuous, Mr. Speaker. But again, Mr. Speaker, I really wanted to point out that because if there had been meetings, as I wanted to have, you would not hear things about continuing professional development centers for our teachers because they would already know that the Bermuda Educators Institute, which actually had its genesis just before I became minister, so that means the now opposition leader MP Cole Simons would have been the Minister of Education during the genesis of the Bermuda Educators Institute. He would have known that is already well and trained to do exactly what he keeps saying that we should introduce. When he talks about foundational counselors, Mr. Speaker, he should know, as a former Minister of Education, about the multi-tiered system of support that does exist within our school, that already exists. If they would come and sit down with me, they would know about the curriculum that incorporates restorative education practices within our school system that we plan to introduce. They would know all of this, Mr. Speaker, but it's often said by the opposition leader, we need to take the politics out of education. Well, I wish he would take the politics out of education. Come and sit and talk so we can all be moving towards the goals we want to move to hand in hand. Instead of having to listen to sound bites like this, instead of listening to absolute rubbish op-eds being written that really reflect nothing and do nothing to help us move education along. That's where we would be, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, when we look at this response and its gotcha moments that are littered throughout, we have to ask ourselves, do we really want to work together? Does the opposition really want the country to succeed? Or is everything got to be political? Is everything got to be from the position of what can I do to make those guys look bad? I can't wait to Wednesday when we do the education budget and see what they do bring with their questions, because we will be ready with the answers they need. We will be ready to show you where we found the savings within our budget, and we will still deliver everything that needs to be delivered for our education system. As the member that did interject said, if they've been sitting in the Zoom consultation, they would know, Mr. Speaker, and they wouldn't have put in here, why is there not any funding in here for the restructuring of our school system? Because the restructuring of our school system and the parish primary school is not stated to start for 2 more fiscal cycles. 2 more fiscal cycles. They would know that. All they have to do is ask before they speak. Now, the last thing on education, Mr. Speaker, and obviously this my colleagues on the other side completely missed. Absolute wonderful press conference that we did 2 weeks ago about the Bermuda College, about the $500,000 in additional support that we've been pumping into the Bermuda College since 2017. The additional support that provides tuition grant, tuition help for students, that has seen 800 students benefit from tuition grants, that has seen a system put in place that allows any student that graduates from our high schools with a 3.0 GPA or more attend the Bermuda College tuition free. That started in 2018, 27 students in the first year, and now we're up to over 80 students taking advantage of that. They would have heard about all of the articulation agreements that the Bermuda College now has that allow you to do 2 years at the Bermuda College and enter directly into the third year of prestigious organizations, institutions in Canada, the US, the UK, and the Caribbean. They would have heard that during the last year of the OBA administration, enrollment had fallen to just over 900 students, and now it has increased dramatically because of the support that this government has given to the Bermuda College. If they had come and sat down to me, they would know of the companies that have now donated to build the new $3.5 million student center that is now under construction at the Bermuda College. They would know about the $1 million that has been put into IT upgrades and increasing the bandwidth and installing new servers and such and rewiring all of the Bermuda College. They would know these things, Mr. Speaker. All they have to do is come and sit and talk. And that's all I ask of them. But Mr. Speaker, thank you for the time that I was given to discuss that reply. It has been a very difficult year for our country. And I applaud the minister for being steadfast. Sometimes he's not the most popular guy when we sit around there with some of the fiscal decisions he forces us to make. But I understand that he cares for all Bermuda. He doesn't care about the political platitudes. He cares about making sure that Bermuda comes out on top, Mr. Speaker. And that is the people, that is the government that this country needs and this country deserves at this time of crisis. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. You indicated you weren't going to use all your 30 minutes. You used 28 of them. How's that? Would any other member like to make a contribution at this time?
Mr. Speaker?
Minister Ferber, are you feeling up to now?
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, I was worst feeling I've ever felt, but anyway, I'm back at it outside for the walk.
All right, you can have your 30 minutes now.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, Mr. Speaker, let me just say that today is our economic debate, and it is my intention to stick with facts and the economic impact on our island home. We all understand the role of the opposition, so it's not surprising what we hear from them, or what we hear, or the public will be hearing. That's the role. They complain, they say what we said or did not say. It's not surprising. So we'll let those things slide. But Mr. Speaker, it's important that there are two things I want to mention, point out that I believe that, I know that the opposition leader was factually wrong. First of all, the BDA was not created by the One Bermuda Alliance. The BDA was created by the Progressive Labour Party in 2012. And the reason why I know that, because I was there to make those things happen. Mr. Speaker, when did it actually start? It did start in March, I think, 2013, under the One Bermuda Alliance, but the actual father was the Progressive Labour Party. Mr. Speaker, another thing that I want to point out, and from time to time you hear the opposition speak about, and they mention on page 28, they say that sinking fund was devised by the late David Soul for a rainy day, just like this one. For clarity, Bermuda should note that the sinking fund was set up specifically to provide for the retirement of debt. And that's absolutely true, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I just happened to be in the room at the time when this thing was all done. And the purpose was David Soul, the former member of Parliament and finance minister, took money out of any surpluses. No money was taken out of when it was a deficit, why would, and just think about Bermudians, when you, even your own self, you say, I'm going to set some money aside. I'm making $10,000 a month. Got some surplus there. I'm going to set aside $3,000 for future other expenditures or buying a car or something, or for retirement. No one says I'm going to set some money aside and go and borrow money when they don't have any money, Mr. Speaker. And that was the whole concept of the Minister of Finance last year, Greg Hurloff. Why would somebody go and borrow money to set aside? So the debt, the money that you're borrowing was higher than what you was paying back, Mr. Speaker. And so the idea was take money out of any surpluses to put towards a sinking fund. And I challenge anyone, and I said, Mr. Speaker, I just happened to be in the room at the time when this particular fund was set up. Good idea. And as time goes on, when we start getting surpluses, and the Minister of Finance is projecting some things, hopefully in 2023, 24, whenever it takes place, and rightfully so, we should take some money aside and set aside for any future capital expenditure. That's what's based on, Mr. Speaker. Putting money aside for any future capital expenditure. Mr. Speaker, someone once said that resilience is fundamentally underpinned by the concept that it is not so much the hard times we face that determine our success or failure, as the way in which we respond to those hard times. Mr. Speaker, I guess the key word is resilience. No one under the sound of my voice, Mr. Speaker, can deny that we have been going through a tough period in 2020. I don't think anyone, Mr. Speaker, and maybe some people have been to World War II, I don't know. I wasn't there. World War I, I don't know. But Mr. Speaker, in my lifetime as a member of Parliament, and my lifetime on this earth, few years I spent here, I have never gone through tough times that we did in 2020. So when the opposition, and I don't remember Michael Dunkley said, talks about job losses and GDP. What do you expect, Mr. Speaker? We all know that there was job losses in 2020. We all know that. We know that GDP would fall in 2020. It's not a surprise that those things took place. Mr. Speaker, I can tell you right now, my head goes off to the Minister of Finance and his team for what they have come through and where they want to take the country. Mr. Speaker, I can tell you right now, it was not easy. Recognizing that we had to raise revenue, recognizing that we want to keep jobs, recognizing that we did not want to go after the union, again, the unions regard to austerity. What do we do? Mr. Speaker, my head goes off to the Minister of Finance, and particularly, Mr. Speaker, my head goes off to the different controllers and the different ministries, and the Miss Tina Tucker, who is the budget officer. Mr. Speaker, it was not easy. And as much as those honorable members can talk and say what they want to do, and that's what is expected out of the opposition, it will be very interesting to see what they would have done at this time. Mr. Speaker, I can probably say that they would not have raised taxes. And Mr. Speaker, they have to do some same things we've really done. The question is, where have we come from, Mr. Speaker, and where are we going? Mr. Speaker, I honestly believe that there's always a particular time in history when certain individuals or certain groups should be in place. 2017, when the electorate voted for the Progressive Party, was the right time. Everything's the right time. There's time to sing, there's time to dance, time to cry. 2017 was the right time. The OBA lost the government. Mr. Speaker, 2020, they lost significant numbers. Significant numbers. Nobody would have guess that amount. Even with my political background, I would never thought we'd have those numbers. But the people of Bermuda had confidence in a government going through rough times, Mr. Speaker, and recognizing where it has come from, particularly with the COVID. And my head goes off to Kim Wilson, I remember Minister Kim Wilson, and the Premier, who every week stood in front of this country and told us where we are, chastised us when it was wrong, pat us on our back when it was right. But at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, the people spoke and said, we want you to take us through this rough time. We want you to take us through the valley. We want you to take us through. And Mr. Speaker, I believe that the timing was right. Mr. Speaker, you may recall that when the government, Progressive Labour Party, took over, they put certain things in place. And let me just say a few things that they put in place. A reduction in payroll tax for those making under $96,000, eliminated payroll tax for the employer who hired disabled Bermudians, first time in history, Mr. Speaker, providing tax relief for first-time entrepreneurs, reducing taxi drivers' payroll taxes from, I think it was average of $2,500 down to $1,000. Not heard of, Mr. Speaker. Reduce custom duties from 5% to 0%. And I can name some of the things I think was particularly healthy foods on, such as eggs and potatoes and cauliflower, broccoli and carrots and turnips, oranges and apples. Mr. Speaker, lost custom duty revenue, but the government believed that if we do these things and other things, we can make things happen. Do the relief on textiles, Mr. Speaker, 2018 budget. Do the relief on sporting clubs, particularly when those of uniforms for young people. Incentives for international business, Mr. Speaker, that encourage them to hire other individuals without paying the payroll tax, long as the numbers was fixed. I think it was at March 31st, 2018. And Mr. Speaker, we saw some of the benefit of that. Mr. Speaker, so the stage was set. So let's take a look at what happened, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I know normally we are able to put lay things on the table so members can see. But Mr. Speaker, if you do mind, with this technology, if you allow me to share some of the graphs I want to at least show the public, if you don't mind, Mr. Speaker.
You can share your screen.
Do you see is it coming up?
We see the graph, yes.
So, Mr. Speaker, let me just look at total revenue. 2000 and this is government's revenue was just under $1 billion, 999. You see that, Mr. Speaker? Speaker?
Yes. Yeah.
It's still okay. The revenue went from 999 to over $1 billion 22, and then in 2019, the revenue went up to 1,060. 1,060. So the revenue was taking place. Mr. Speaker, if we look at government expenditure, it was $1,176,000,000 in 2017. It reduced, Mr. Speaker, in 2018 to $1,082 billion. In 2019, it went down to 1,075, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, you saw that things were taking place within the economy. We saw construction go from 147 in 2017 to 172 in 2018 to 201 in 2019. If we look at Table 10, Mr. Speaker, we talk about policy that the government put in place to allow creation of dwelling units. Went from 62 dwellings completed in 2017 to 80 in 2018 to 81 in 2019. This is a policy that the Progressive Party put in place. As a matter of fact, it reflects on some of the retail sales, which I will show the honorable members later on. So, Mr. Speaker, you saw that we were, the honorable member was talking about employment earlier on. Let me just see if I can pull that figure up. (2018) Mr. Speaker, 2017, 33.6 thousand, 33.8, 34.3. Mr. Speaker, my point is that things were happening. Things were happening, and matter of fact, the projection, I think the Minister of Finance had for last year and this year was been either break even regarding our financial situation or even additional surplus before interest on the debt. Mr. Speaker, COVID struck us. COVID struck us, Mr. Speaker. Something that none of us could have controlled. Unfortunately, GP contracted by 8.5%, as reported by the Minister of Finance. There was job declines. Surprise, surprise, Mr. Speaker. Irregulars decrease. Who is surprised with that, Mr. Speaker? There have been planes that are coming in that irregulars are going to decrease. Cruise ships fell off. No, the cruise ships are coming in, Mr. Speaker, because of COVID. Government revenue was impacted by, I believe, $161 million, and the budget deficit, which is depicted, you see in the estimate and revenue, I think it's $247 million. Mr. Speaker, there were some bright spots in 2020. Mr. Speaker, let me just see if I can find those numbers. As you can see, the current GDP went from in 2000 and Mr. Speaker, do you see this one? Make sure they're seeing this.
Yes.
GDP went from 7.1, 7.2 up to 7.4. This is 2019 here, and of course it dropped off in 2020. Retail sales index, Mr. Speaker, look at this now. Look at this.
Mm-hmm.
Look at this, Mr. Speaker. January was down 2.3. February was up 2.2. March up 4.3. What happened in March, Mr. Speaker? And we see a drop in retail sales. No one was shopping. Went down 30.1%. Then climbed to 13.8% of retail sales in May. Then it climbed to, this is things that the government started putting things in place. Come out and start shopping, start buying. We knew people were flying out and taking the trips. But Mr. Speaker, thank God that we had some Bermudans who said, we're going to go out and invest in some small mom and pop stores, and larger stores, particularly in the places like dorms. The government had policies in place to improve the idea of to speed up building projects and stuff like that. And then 1.3, Mr. Speaker, we started having our positive move in July. Look what happened after that, Mr. Speaker. In August, went by 10.1. September, 6.8. October, 8.7. November, 8. And Mr. Speaker, first time you heard this is 14.2 in December. Mr. Speaker, there were some bright spots. And yes, because Bermudas were home, the shopping, you know that. But as you know, Mr. Speaker, they also had the ability to shop online, which many of them did. We saw some increases in courier packages, people buying from FedEx and the rest of the stores. Now, I don't know how I come out of this, Mr. Speaker, so you might see that graph for a while. So, Mr. Speaker, the statistical data proves that we were heading in the right direction. But with the bump in the road, where do we go from here? Where do we go from here? And I heard that the opposition states that the government basically implying that they don't have no plan. Mr. Speaker, there's no doubt that what I heard them say is what I knew they was going to say. Recognizing, Mr. Speaker, that I can tell you right now that this government has a plan. And in due time, you will hear about it. The layout by the Premier in his statement today lays out some key points in regards to economic diversification. And I heard honorable members talk about vertical farming. Mr. Speaker, you can bet your bottom dollar that will take place. As I told the honorable members, particularly Jackson, the government is doing some more due diligence. Don't stop. But you can bet your bottom dollar, Mr. Speaker, that's going to take place. And there are other things that we're working on, Mr. Speaker, but we want to make sure that our due diligence is done and make sure we get some other information out there. But I can guarantee, Mr. Speaker, this government will move ahead to get the vertical farming done, and not owned by the government, Mr. Speaker. Despite all the craziness I hear out there that the government's going to own this vertical farm. No, Mr. Speaker. The government made a commitment that we will make sure that we have Bermudians that has investment in things that we do. We want Bermudians to own predominantly of that vertical farming. We want Bermudians to own it. And so that's why we did more measurement, looking at numbers to make sure the return on investment is there, how we just have the structures. Those things are being worked on, Mr. Speaker. I'm confident, Mr. Speaker, in due time, the public will hear where we are and how we move ahead in regards to that. And there are other great stuff, Mr. Speaker. There are great things that this party is doing in regards to moving as far as growth is concerned. Financial markets, infrastructure investment, expanding the resident population. These days, the Premier spoke about today, healthcare regulatory reform, and the list goes on and on. Mr. Speaker, just because we don't put everything in the budget statement doesn't mean that it's not happening. It doesn't mean that the public won't know. The public will know. The Premier has made a commitment that the Minister of Finance will come sometime into season and lay out the points that we plan to move ahead with, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I mentioned earlier that Bermudians are resilient. I believe we can recover quickly from difficulties. We have the brain power in this island home of ours to come up with right solutions. This government was elected to lead, Mr. Speaker, and to make decisions in the best interest of our people and residents alike. Mr. Speaker, this government summary of consolidated fund speaks to we will incur a deficit of this year of $124 million. We'll incur a deficit of $40 million. These are projections, Mr. Speaker. Could change, we know that, in 2021, 2022. Mr. Speaker, if we were to incur a surplus in 2023 of surplus in 2023. Mr. Speaker, these numbers are not just put there to put there, because the government has a plan. And as I said, Mr. Speaker, everyone will hear of those plans as we go along. Mr. Speaker, the future is in good hands under this government. And the buds of the tree will blossom very soon. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to end on this quote. The past is a place of reference, not a place of residence. The past is a place of learning, not a place of learning. Let us put our minds together and see what we can do to make Bermuda a better place for every one of us, especially our children. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker. Oh, I can't hear you. Anything. I can try to disconnect. Mr. Speaker, can you hear me? there we go. Just, okay, great.
MP, I can hear you, MP. I can hear you loud and clear.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I raise a point of order as it relates to for guidance from you. The Honorable Minister alluded to tabling those spreadsheets, and understanding Order 16. I believe that we're entitled to get a copy of those, and I would like to know when we would get a copy of those. The quarterly bulletin of statistics, tables 5, 6, 9, 10, and 18, and the document as well labeled RSI Maving Average 2020 with worksheets GDP and RSI.
Mr. Speaker, I have no problem of passing that information.
Sorry, my mic was muted. I'm sorry. Hold on. If we were in the House, Whip, yes, the minister would have had to table it. We weren't in the House. He asked permission to share it on the screen so we all saw it. But the expectation is that, yes, as soon as possible, we'll have it circulated so that all members can have a hard copy. The fact that he shared it to us and allowed it to take place, because had we been in the House, we would have been seeing it anyway. So if he weren't speaking to something that we didn't see, the fact that he shared it on the screen, we all saw it. Mm-hmm. But yes, the follow-up to that would be that a copy would be made available, whether he sends it out electronically, or, which I do suggest, that he just send it out electronically so that all members can get it. If you send it to this office, we could have it put on the SharePoint site. But you do need to follow up, Minister, to make sure we all get a copy of it.
No problem, Mr. Speaker. I will have the Department of Statistics to send that information to you.
Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, on that point of order, what's the guidance if we don't get it before the Committee of Supply when it would be of most use?
Well,
what I raised the point of what I would have raised in the second.
We would like to have it as soon as possible. So, Minister, as soon as possible, if you can get it sent over, because the budget debate will start on Monday, and if someone wants to make reference to it, at least we have it. Okay?
Mr. Speaker, I have no problem of sharing this information so the opposition can be educated.
Thank you. With that said, I think we took care of the point of order. Does any other member wish to make a contribution at this time?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
MP Cannoneer?
Yes.
Yes. MP, you have your 30 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and good afternoon to colleagues and to Bermuda as a whole. I'd like to start out by saying thank you to the opposition leader for his methodical reply and his consideration on where we are, how we should be potentially moving forward, and his contribution. Certainly want to thank the Dunkley as well, as he articulated well our issues. In addition to that, I also would like to thank the Finance Minister for this opportunity that we do have to sit down and to consider not only his thoughts on where we need to go forward as far as Bermuda is concerned, but Cabinet as a whole. The budget certainly is presented by the Minister, but it is a reflection clearly on not just what the Finance Minister believes, but additionally on what the Cabinet believes on where we should be going forward. As years have gone by, I've come to understand that this whole budgetary period and the presentations really are twofold, to say. Number one, to report on what has been happening, what has been done, not just in numbers, when we look at dollar values and the likes, debt and revenue, but to put some flesh and some meat around that, to explain exactly how our people